My son and his wife forgot about me for years. I constantly helped them financially and sent them gifts, but they just ignored me. After so many attempts, I got tired. I changed my name, sold my house, and disappeared without a trace. 10 months later, they found out exactly what happens when you cut off the man who built the ground you walk on. I am Garrett, 69 years old, a retired structural engineer, and a man who learned the hard way that blood does not guarantee loyalty. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and mistook your silence for weakness. The waiter at the upscale downtown steakhouse cleared his throat softly, asking if I still wanted to keep the 2 empty chairs at my table. I looked at the gold watch on my wrist, a retirement gift to myself. It was 8:15 in the evening. My dinner reservation had been for 7 o'clock sharp. I nodded slowly, telling him to go ahead and take the extra plates away. I was sitting entirely alone on my 69th birthday, staring at a perfectly cooked ribeye steak that had gone completely cold. I had called my son Devin 4 times. I had called my daughter-in-law Megan twice. Every single call went straight to voicemail. I had spent the last hour convincing myself they were stuck in city traffic, or perhaps Devin had a late emergency meeting at his tech investment firm. But the bitter truth was glowing right in the palm of my hand. I opened the social media app on my phone. Megan's profile was the very first thing to pop up. A bright flashing circle around her picture indicated a new live video broadcast. I tapped the screen. The quiet ambiance of the steakhouse was instantly replaced by the deafening sound coming from my phone speaker, a live DJ playing heavy bass music, the clinking of expensive champagne glasses, and the loud cheers of a massive crowd. They were not stuck in traffic. They were not working late. They were hosting a lavish, over-the-top housewarming party at the sprawling suburban mansion I had co-signed the massive loan for just 6 months ago. The camera flipped around to show Megan dressed in a sparkling designer silk gown holding a glass of vintage champagne. She leaned into the phone's microphone, laughing loudly. She told her thousands of followers that this magnificent house was purely a result of their own hard work, a self-made paradise built from the ground up. Then Devin walked into the frame. He wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, looking smug and successful. Megan looked directly into the camera lens, her lips curling into a cruel smirk. She told her audience that they were finally celebrating their peace away from the draining energy of toxic family members who only wanted to hold them back and guilt-trip them. Toxic family members. That was me. The man who had drained a significant portion of his life savings to ensure they got the absolute best mortgage rate on that very property. I watched the video loop 3 consecutive times. I did not shed a single tear. I did not throw my phone. I did not leave an angry, emotional voicemail. I quietly signaled the waiter, paid the expensive bill in full, left a generous tip, and walked out into the chilly night air. When a massive bridge is about to collapse, it does not scream. The steel groans, the concrete splinters microscopically, and the entire structure gets very, very quiet before gravity takes over and destroys everything. I spent 40 years of my life working as a senior structural engineer. I know exactly how to identify a fatal hidden flaw, and I know exactly how to meticulously dismantle a failing structure before it kills everyone inside. Driving through the quiet city streets, gripping the leather steering wheel, the loving father in me died, and the cold, calculating engineer took over completely. I did not drive to their party to confront them. Confrontation is an emotional reaction, and emotions make you careless and stupid. Instead, I drove straight to the downtown business district. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night, but I knew Mr. Hayes would still be at his desk. Hayes was a ruthless corporate attorney, a man who viewed the legal system not as an instrument of justice, but as a surgical scalpel used to dissect his opponents. We had been friends and business associates for over 2 decades. When I walked into his mahogany-paneled office, he looked up from his stacks of paperwork, clearly surprised to see me so late, especially on my birthday. He started to offer me a glass of scotch to celebrate, but he stopped mid-sentence when he saw the dead, empty look in my eyes. I sat down heavily in the leather chair opposite his desk and asked him to pull up every single financial record, trust document, and property deed associated with my name. Hayes frowned, adjusting his reading glasses, asking what was going on. I told him I needed a complete top-to-bottom financial audit of my entire estate immediately. I wanted to see every single bank account my son had access to, every credit card linked to my name, and the exact legal standing of the mansion I had co-signed for them. I spoke with the clinical, detached precision of a man evaluating a site for demolition. I explained that Devin and Megan had made it crystal clear I was no longer part of their family, which meant my financial infrastructure was no longer going to be part of their lives. I was ready to sever the ties permanently. I fully expected to find a few overdrawn credit cards or perhaps a missed car payment. I expected the usual financial carelessness of an arrogant young man trying to impress a deeply materialistic wife. What I did not expect was the sheer scale of the rot hiding beneath the surface. Hayes turned to his dual computer monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the secured legal and banking databases. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of keys and the distant hum of city traffic outside the window. Then the clicking stopped abruptly. Hayes leaned closer to the screen. His posture went completely rigid. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes as if he were seeing things, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his usually stoic face. It was pure, unadulterated shock. He slowly turned one of the monitors toward me. He asked me in a quiet, strained voice if I had recently taken out a massive loan against my own house. I stared at him, genuinely confused. I told him my house had been fully paid off for 15 years. It was the house where I raised Devin, the house where my late wife Nadine and I had spent our best, happiest years together. The deed was completely clear. There was no mortgage. Hayes took a deep breath and pointed a shaking finger at a scanned document on the screen. It was a property lien, a second mortgage. Someone had taken out a massive, high-interest loan using my fully paid childhood home as collateral. The loan amount was exactly $300,000. I leaned in my eyes, scanning the fine print of the legal document, looking for the signature at the very bottom of the page. There it was. My name, Garrett, signed in what looked exactly like my handwriting, but I had never seen this document in my life. The notary stamp next to it belonged to a shady firm known for turning a blind eye to technicalities. Hayes rapidly pulled up the wire transfer records associated with the fraudulent loan. The $300,000 had not gone to any bank account I controlled. It had been funneled directly into a newly created shell company, which was then immediately used to pay a high-end luxury contracting firm. It was the exact same contracting firm that had just spent the last 6 months installing imported Italian marble countertops, custom heated flooring, and a massive backyard infinity pool at Devin and Megan's new mansion. The realization hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. Devin had not just forgotten my birthday. He had not just insulted me on the internet to score points with his superficial friends. My own son had forged my signature, committed severe financial fraud, and secretly mortgaged the home I lived in to fund his wife's lavish home renovations. And it got worse. Much worse. Hayes scrolled down to the payment history section of the loan. Devin had not made a single payment on this fraudulent mortgage in 4 months. The bank had already issued a preliminary notice of default. In less than 30 days, the bank was going to initiate foreclosure proceedings on my home. I was going to be thrown out into the street. Devin had mortgaged my past to finance his future, fully expecting me to quietly take the fall when the bank came knocking. Hayes looked at me, waiting for me to explode, waiting for the rage, the yelling, the heartbreak of a betrayed father. But I just sat back in the heavy leather chair, staring at the forged signature on the glowing screen. The silence in the room was suffocating. My son thought I was just a naive, disposable old man he could throw away when he was done extracting my resources. He forgot what I did for a living. He forgot that I know exactly how to bring a building down on top of the people inside it, and I was about to detonate the foundation of his entire life. Hayes reached for the heavy phone on his desk, his hand hovering over the receiver. He asked if I wanted him to contact the police fraud division, or if I preferred to confront Devin directly while wearing a wiretap. I shook my head slowly and told him to take his hand off the phone. Calling the police would be a messy, emotional explosion. Devin would immediately hire defense attorneys, he would drag my name through the mud, and Megan would inevitably spin a tearful story about how I was just a confused, vindictive old man trying to ruin their perfect lives. No, an engineer does not start a loud, messy fire to bring down a condemned building. He quietly removes the load-bearing pillars and lets physics do the rest. I reached into my coat pocket and handed Hayes a small encrypted flash drive. For years, Devin assumed my only income was my standard state pension and a modest savings account. He had no idea that during the prime of my career, I was the lead structural consultant on 5 major international airports and 2 overseas hydroelectric dams. The highly lucrative consulting fees from those massive international contracts had been quietly compounding in an offshore retirement portfolio for over a decade. I looked Hayes dead in the eyes and instructed him to liquidate exactly $300,000 from that hidden portfolio. I told him to wire the funds directly to the bank the very next morning and pay off Devon's fraudulent mortgage in full. Hayes stared at me, completely baffled by the request. He warned me that paying the debt would legally validate the forged loan, meaning I would never see that money again. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. I told him I was not paying off my son's debt. I was buying the trap. Once the bank was fully paid, they would release the lien and the deed to my property would be entirely mine again. The moment the wire transfer cleared and the bank confirmed receipt, the house was mine again. But I knew exactly how Devon operated. He was wildly arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid when it came to technology. He worked in high-level tech investment, which meant he had undoubtedly set up invasive credit monitoring alerts on my social security number to keep a watchful eye on his fraudulent handiwork. If I made any sudden legal moves, an automated alert would ping his phone instantly, giving him ample time to react and cover his tracks. I needed him completely blind. Through a highly discreet contact Hayes provided, I hired an independent digital security specialist, a white-hat hacker who made his living building and dismantling corporate espionage defenses. I paid the man in untraceable cash to systematically scrub my digital footprint. Within 6 hours, the hacker had successfully breached the credit monitoring accounts Devon had illegally set up in my name. He did not delete the accounts, which would have triggered an immediate warning. Instead, he subtly rerouted the alert notifications to a dead server and locked the recovery options. As far as Devon's phone was concerned, my financial status was perfectly dormant. With my digital shadow effectively erased, I made my next aggressive move. For the past 3 years, a massive commercial real estate developer had been relentlessly sending me letters desperate to buy my property so he could bulldoze it and build a luxury condominium complex. I had always refused because of the deep sentimental value of the home. But sentimental value was now a luxury I could no longer afford. I called the developer directly. I told him I would sell him the entire property for cash, 20% below the current market value, but only under one absolute non-negotiable condition. We had to close the deal, transfer the deed, and initiate demolition within 48 hours. The developer thought I was desperate for liquidity. He had no idea I was just ruthlessly efficient. The ink on the cash sale contract was dry by Thursday afternoon. I did not hold a yard sale. I did not hire a moving company. I left the antique wooden furniture, the heavy family photo albums, and the fine china right where they were sitting. Everything that belonged to the old Garrett was now just debris waiting to be cleared away. On Friday morning, I stood quietly on the sidewalk across the street holding a steaming cup of black coffee. The ground beneath my heavy boots trembled as massive yellow excavators rolled onto the property. I watched without a single ounce of regret as the heavy metal claws tore through the roof of the house where I had lived for 4 decades. The walls where I had proudly measured Devon's height as a young child collapsed into a thick cloud of gray dust and splintered wood. By noon, the entire physical structure was completely gone, replaced by a massive empty crater in the earth. Garrett's home was officially dead. Now it was time for Garrett himself to follow suit. I walked straight down to the county courthouse and submitted a fast-tracked petition for a legal name change. The judge pounded his heavy wooden gavel, and in a matter of minutes, Garrett was legally erased from the public record. I walked out of the grand courtroom doors as Anton Cole. I went straight back to the downtown office of Mr. Hayes to execute the final fatal maneuver of the week. Because I had paid off the fraudulent loan that directly funded the expensive renovations on Devon and Megan's new mansion, Hayes used a brilliant piece of legal subrogation to restructure the debt. He quietly transferred the underlying title and the leverage of their mansion into a newly formed, completely anonymous corporate entity. I named the holding company the Nadine Trust in honor of my late wife, the woman whose memory Devon had so casually disrespected. Devon and Megan were currently living their absolute best lives, hosting extravagant weekend parties and flaunting their supposed wealth on social media, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality creeping up on them. They had no idea that the ground they were standing on had just been sold right out from under their expensive designer shoes. They no longer owned their dream home. I did. I packed a single leather suitcase with a few practical changes of clothes and my old engineering notebooks. I placed my old cell phone, which was still receiving the occasional missed call from Devon's automated calendar reminders, directly into a heavy-duty industrial shredder in Hayes' office. I shook my lawyer's hand, walked out into the busy, anonymous city streets, and vanished without a trace. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. 10 months would pass before they felt the very first tremor of the earthquake I had just set in motion. 10 months passed in absolute silence. For me, they were months of meticulous planning and quiet reinvention under my completely new legal identity. For Devin and Megan, they were months of reckless consumption, completely blind to the fact that they were dancing on a trapdoor I had already unlatched. The illusion of their infinite wealth finally shattered on a bright Tuesday afternoon inside an exclusive designer boutique downtown. Megan stood at the polished marble checkout counter, an extravagant stack of imported leather handbags, custom shoes, and silk scarves piled high in front of her. The total came to just over $14,000, a casual Tuesday expense for a woman who firmly believed she possessed an endless supply of money. She barely looked at the cashier as she handed over her heavy platinum credit card, already busy texting her friends about her latest shopping spree. The cashier swiped the card through the machine. The terminal beeped loudly, flashing a bright red error message across its digital screen. The cashier frowned and tried inserting the encrypted chip. Another loud, sharp beep echoed through the quiet, luxurious boutique, instantly drawing the judgmental eyes of the other wealthy patrons in the store. The cashier handed the platinum card back with an apologetic but incredibly firm smile, stating the transaction had been completely declined by the issuing bank. Megan's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. She snatched the card back from the counter, her voice raising in sharp indignation as she loudly insisted there had to be a technical mistake with their cheap machine. She reached into her designer purse and threw down 2 more premium credit cards. Both were swiped. Both were instantly rejected with the same loud, humiliating beep. The public embarrassment quickly morphed into blinding, irrational rage. She abandoned the massive pile of designer goods, stormed out of the boutique, and immediately dialed Devin's number on her phone. She screamed into the receiver the second he answered, demanding to know why her cards were suddenly frozen and furiously accusing him of hiding his bonus money from her. She had absolutely no idea that the financial well had not just run dry, the entire aquifer had been legally drained and sealed off. Sitting in his sleek glass corner office high above the city, Devin flinched at his wife's shrill, panicked accusations. He quickly hung up the phone, his heart pounding a sudden erratic rhythm against his ribs. He immediately logged into his primary banking portal on his work computer, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. He fully expected to see a temporary security hold or perhaps a simple administrative system glitch that he could resolve with a quick phone call. Instead, the screen loaded to display a series of bright red negative balances across all his personal checking and savings accounts. But that was not what made his blood run completely cold. He frantically scrolled down to the linked accounts section, the hidden financial safety net he had secretly relied on for years to float his extravagant lifestyle. Every single account associated with my name, the emergency funds, the joint credit lines, the collateral backups, was entirely gone. It did not say the accounts were frozen. It did not say they were temporarily restricted. The accounts simply did not exist anymore, completely wiped from the bank's digital infrastructure as if they had never been there in the first place. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his usual wall of arrogance. He grabbed his cell phone and tried calling my personal number. He heard the harsh automated message stating the number had been permanently disconnected and was no longer in service. Devin grabbed his car keys and bolted out of his office, completely ignoring his executive assistant who tried to hand him a stack of urgent meeting briefs for a multi-million-dollar tech merger. He drove his expensive imported sports car aggressively through the heavy city traffic, breaking multiple speed limits and weaving recklessly between lanes to reach my old suburban neighborhood. He frantically rehearsed his angry speech during the entire drive. He was going to bang aggressively on my front door, demand I fix the banking error immediately, and threaten to cut me out of his life forever if I did not comply with his demands. He turned the corner onto my familiar quiet residential street, his tires screeching violently against the asphalt. He slammed his foot on the brakes, throwing his expensive car into park right in the middle of the road. He stepped out of the vehicle, his jaw dropping in absolute paralyzing disbelief. He was not looking at the sturdy brick house where he had grown up. He was looking at a massive, muddy construction crater surrounded by tall chain-link security fences. A bright yellow bulldozer sat idle in the center of the massive dirt pit. A large wooden billboard proudly announced the upcoming arrival of a luxury townhome community. There was no house. There was no father waiting inside to bail him out of his financial mess. The safety net was completely gone, and the ground beneath his feet was entirely empty. Devin stood frozen on the concrete sidewalk for 20 minutes, staring blankly into the gaping hole in the earth. The reality of the situation was far too massive for his privileged, entitled mind to properly process. He pulled out his phone with violently trembling hands and dialed the local police department. He bypassed the non-emergency line and spoke directly to a desk sergeant, his voice cracking in genuine panic as he attempted to report a missing person. He gave the police officer my full legal name, my exact age, and the address of the newly demolished property, frantically explaining that his elderly father had somehow been displaced, manipulated, or perhaps even kidnapped by fraudulent commercial real estate developers. He aggressively demanded they dispatch a squad car and a detective immediately to investigate the construction site. The desk sergeant told him to calm down and placed him on an agonizing hold. Devin paced back and forth along the metal fence line, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead, his mind racing with terrifying scenarios. 10 agonizing minutes passed before a different officer, a senior detective, finally picked up the line. The detective's tone was entirely flat, completely devoid of the urgency or sympathy Devin expected. The detective informed him that he had just run a thorough background check through the state and federal identification databases. He told Devin in a stern voice to stop wasting valuable police resources on a closed matter. Devin yelled into the phone, demanding to know what the detective was talking about and insisting his father was in danger. The detective read directly from his computer screen, his words dropping like heavy stones into Devin's ear. The detective stated very clearly that Garrett was legally documented as voluntarily relocated and his assets were entirely liquidated through proper legal channels. Furthermore, the federal system flagged the new identity and location as permanently sealed under a high-level privacy injunction, a legal tool often utilized in cases of extreme familial estrangement to prevent unwanted harassment. The detective concluded the brief call by stating that the subject was perfectly safe, legally autonomous, and most importantly had filed formal binding legal documentation, strictly revoking any and all contact rights from his next of kin. The detective hung up the phone without another word, leaving Devin listening to the cold, dead tone of the disconnected line. The expensive smartphone slipped from Devin's sweaty grip, falling and shattering its screen on the hard concrete sidewalk. He looked back at the empty dirt crater where his childhood home used to stand. He finally understood the absolute crushing finality of my absence. The endless stream of money, the quiet patience, the unconditional financial bailouts, they were all gone forever. He was entirely cut off, financially bleeding out in the middle of the street and completely alone. And he had absolutely no idea that the real punishment had not even begun to strike. The financial strangulation did not take long to suffocate the life out of their pristine, carefully curated marriage. Within just a few days of Devin standing helplessly in front of that empty construction site, the crushing reality of their frozen assets crashed headfirst into their extravagant daily routine. The screaming matches echoed loudly through the high vaulted ceilings of their custom-built mansion. Megan was furious, pacing back and forth across the imported Italian marble floors, hurling accusations and demanding to know how her husband could be so incredibly incompetent. Her lifestyle was entirely built on the perception of limitless wealth and the sudden inability to pay for her weekly spa treatments. Private Pilates instructors and premium meal deliveries felt like a personal insult to her. Devin sat on the expensive velvet sofa, his head buried in his hands, completely exhausted from fighting with bank representatives who refused to give him any information. He tried to explain that his father had somehow orchestrated a massive, legally airtight disappearance, but Megan refused to listen to what she called pathetic excuses. She accused him of secretly funneling money to a mistress. She accused him of terrible investments. The air inside the house was thick with venom and absolute distrust. Right in the middle of a particularly vicious shouting match about a past-due country club membership bill, the heavy brass knocker on their custom mahogany front door echoed through the grand foyer. Devin dragged himself off the sofa, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, expecting another angry delivery driver or a neighbor complaining about the noise. Instead, he opened the door to find a uniformed postal worker holding an electronic signature pad and a thick, rigid manila envelope plastered with bright red certified mail stickers. Devin hastily scribbled his signature on the digital pad, snatched the heavy envelope, and slammed the front door shut. He tore the thick paper open, expecting a final warning from one of his maxed-out platinum credit cards. He pulled out a dense stack of heavily watermarked legal documents. The very first page was printed on the thick, intimidating letterhead of a premier downtown law firm, the exact firm where my trusted friend Mr. Hayes operated as a senior partner. Devin's eyes darted rapidly across the paragraphs of complex legal terminology, desperately trying to comprehend the wall of text. Then his gaze locked onto the bold, capitalized letters at the center of the page. It was a formal declaration of ownership and notice of default. He flipped to the second page, his hands beginning to shake violently. The document clearly outlined the precise history of the $300,000 mortgage he had fraudulently obtained using my forged signature. It detailed how the debt had been abruptly paid in full 10 months ago, but the payoff was not a gift. It was a highly calculated strategic acquisition. The documents explicitly explained that the debt had been fully purchased and legally absorbed by an anonymous corporate holding company known as the Nadine Trust. Through a seamless legal subrogation clause which Devon had blindly agreed to when he initially signed the shady loan documents, the Nadine Trust was now the sole primary lien holder on the entire estate. Because the original loan was inextricably tied to the property's primary deed, the trust held absolute leverage over the physical house. Devon felt the room spinning around him as he read the next paragraph. The trap I had laid was flawless. An engineer knows that you do not need to break the strongest steel beam to bring down a bridge. You simply let the environment slowly rust the structural bolts until gravity does the work for you. The unpaid taxes were the rust. For the past 10 months, Devon had completely ignored the county property tax assessments. He had arrogantly assumed that the automated banking systems linked to my name were still silently paying the massive quarterly tax bills just as they had always done for his other expenses. But my accounts were gone, and the county had not received a single dime in property taxes for almost a year. According to the strict terms of the property deed and the restructured loan agreement now controlled by the Nadine Trust, a severe delinquency in property taxes constituted an immediate and uncorrectable default. The trust was legally executing its right to seize the underlying collateral to protect its massive financial investment. Devon was not just deeply in debt, he had completely forfeited his legal right to the property. He did not own the imported marble floors, the heated infinity pool, or the grand foyer. He was nothing more than an unauthorized squatter living inside a monument to his own greed, and the rightful owner had finally arrived to claim the keys. Megan noticed the blood completely drain from her husband's face. She stopped. Her angry pacing crossed her arms tightly over her chest and demanded to know what was written on those papers. Devon could not even form a coherent sentence. He simply let the heavy stack of legal documents slip from his trembling fingers, scattering them across the expensive designer rug. Megan knelt down, snatched the top page, and began reading the bold print for herself. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she reached the final irrefutable decree stamped at the very bottom of the page. It was an official notice to quit signed and authorized by a county judge. The bold red ink stated unequivocally that they had exactly 72 hours to completely vacate the premises. If they did not willingly surrender the property and hand over the keys by Friday morning, the county sheriff's department was fully authorized to arrive with armed deputies, physically remove them from the premises, and place all their belongings on the public curb. Megan dropped the paper as if it had physically burned her hands. A piercing, hysterical scream erupted from her throat, echoing off the high ceilings. She lunged at Devon, grabbing the collar of his expensive dress shirt, violently shaking him. She shrieked that this was her absolute dream home. The house she had spent months designing, the house she had proudly paraded in front of millions of followers online. The very thought of her wealthy friends and social media rivals watching her get physically evicted by the police was worse than death to her. She demanded he call his lawyers, call the bank, call anyone to fix the massive disaster he had brought upon them. Devon just stared at her with dead, empty eyes, whispering quietly that there was no money left for lawyers. He told her they were completely ruined. The realization hit Megan like a physical blow to the chest. The glamorous, wealthy tech executive she had married was suddenly nothing but a heavy anchor dragging her down into humiliating poverty. The fake, loving smile she used for her internet videos vanished completely, replaced by a cold mask of pure, selfish survival. She stepped back, looking at her husband with absolute, undisguised disgust. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger straight at his face, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper. She told him that if he allowed them to be dragged out of this house by the police like common criminals, she would pack her bags, file for an immediate divorce, and leave him to rot in the streets alone. The profound loyalty she had eagerly sworn at the wedding altar was entirely conditional on his bank account, and the final check had just bounced. Megan's sharp footsteps echoed down the hallway as she stormed off, leaving Devon standing entirely alone in the grand foyer. He stared at the eviction notice still scattered across the imported rug. He had less than 72 hours to save his marriage, his home, and his entire social standing. He needed to find the person controlling the Nadine Trust, and he needed to find them immediately. If he could just put a face to the faceless corporation, he believed he could intimidate them, bribe them, or trap them in a lengthy legal battle to buy himself some time. But leverage required capital, and his personal bank accounts were completely barren. Desperation breeds catastrophic decisions. Devin walked into his lavish home office and booted up his secured work laptop. He bypassed the standard employee portals and logged directly into his executive corporate expense account. It was a discretionary fund strictly reserved for high-level client entertainment and emergency corporate travel. Using it for personal legal matters was a severe violation of his employment contract, a fireable offense that bordered on embezzlement. He did not care. He immediately wired a massive $25,000 retainer fee to an underground private investigator he had previously used for aggressive corporate espionage. The investigator was a man who specialized in piercing corporate veils and dragging hidden entities out into the harsh light of day. Devin sent the man a scanned copy of the eviction notice and a single frantic instruction to find the exact name and physical address of the person hiding behind the Nadine Trust, no matter the cost or the methods required. For the next 48 hours, the mansion felt like a sprawling, silent tomb. Megan refused to leave the master bedroom, spending her time frantically packing her most expensive designer clothes and jewelry into heavy luxury trunks. Devin paced the floors of his office, constantly refreshing his email and staring at his phone. The clock was mercilessly ticking down to the Friday morning eviction deadline. Late Thursday afternoon, his phone finally vibrated. It was the investigator. Devin answered immediately, demanding the target's location. The investigator's voice was unusually tense, lacking his typical arrogant confidence. He told Devin that he had successfully cracked the initial shell company layers. The Nadine Trust was legally managed by a man named Anton Cole. Devin aggressively demanded Anton Cole's home address, fully prepared to drive there and physically force the man to withdraw the eviction notice. But the investigator stopped him. He warned Devin to drop the matter entirely and walk away from the house. The investigator explained that whoever this Anton Cole was, he was not a normal real estate investor. Cole's digital footprint was completely scrubbed, shielded by military-grade encryption, and backed by legal firewalls that only top-tier corporate assassins used. The investigator stated that digging any further would trigger catastrophic digital countermeasures, and he was officially cutting ties and keeping the retainer. The line went completely dead. Devin threw his phone against the leather sofa in a fit of absolute rage. Anton Cole. The name meant absolutely nothing to him. He assumed it was just a ruthless Wall Street vulture who had bought his debt for pennies on the dollar. He refused to be intimidated. He marched out of his office, grabbing his keys and his heavy wool coat, determined to drive down to the county records department to hunt this Anton Cole down himself. But before his hand could even touch the brass handle of the front door, a heavy, rhythmic knock echoed through the foyer. Devin froze. He glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was too early for the county sheriff, and the eviction deadline was not until the next morning. He assumed it was Megan's aggressive divorce lawyers arriving to serve him papers. He took a deep breath, puffed out his chest to project an air of authority he no longer possessed, and pulled the heavy door open. He was not greeting local deputies or private attorneys. Two men in plain, unwrinkled, dark suits stood on his front porch. They did not look angry. They looked incredibly bored, which was infinitely more terrifying. The man on the left reached into his breast pocket and produced a solid black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a heavy gold badge. He introduced himself as a special agent with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Devin felt the remaining blood drain completely from his face. His knees suddenly felt like they were made of water. The second agent handed Devin a thick, tightly bound manila folder. Devin did not need to open it to know exactly what was inside. During my financial audit with Mr. Hayes 10 months ago, my hired digital security specialist had not just scrubbed my own records. While bypassing Devin's credit alerts, the hacker had stumbled upon Devin's hidden offshore banking portals. For the past 3 years, Devin had been quietly funneling his massive year-end corporate bonuses into an undeclared account in the Cayman Islands, deliberately hiding the wealth from both the federal government and his own materialistic wife. I had meticulously compiled every single ledger, every wire transfer receipt, and every hidden IP address. As Anton Cole, I had anonymously mailed the perfectly organized whistleblower package directly to the desk of the Federal Tax Authority. The agent looked at Devin with cold, dead eyes and informed him that his entire financial existence was now under a comprehensive federal audit. They were officially freezing his remaining corporate assets, and opening a criminal investigation for 3 consecutive years of felony tax evasion. The trap I had built was not just a cage, it was a suffocating vacuum, and Devin had just drawn his last breath of freedom. The moment the federal agents walked out the front door, leaving Devin hyperventilating on the foyer floor, Megan knew the game was entirely over. She did not kneel down to comfort her husband. She did not offer a single word of support or a reassuring touch. The IRS did not negotiate, and they did not care about a person's social standing or their carefully curated internet presence. They were a financial grim reaper. And Megan understood immediately that every bank account, every investment portfolio, and every credit card attached to Devin's name was now completely frozen under a mandatory federal hold. The luxury life she had aggressively clawed her way into was disintegrating before her eyes, burning to ash in a matter of seconds. She ran up the sweeping curved staircase to the master bedroom and locked the heavy oak door behind her. If the house was going to be seized by my trust, and her husband was inevitably going to federal prison for tax evasion, she needed untraceable liquidity, and she needed it immediately. She hurried over to her massive walk-in closet, pushing past racks of designer coats, and pulled out a hidden biometric wall safe. She pressed her thumb to the glowing scanner, the heavy metal door clicking open to reveal her ultimate emergency fund. Sitting perfectly undisturbed on the top shelf was a heavy black velvet box. Inside lay the extravagant diamond jewelry collection I had personally handed to her on the day of her wedding. A stunning teardrop necklace, a matching set of chandelier earrings, and a thick tennis bracelet caught the overhead light. She smiled greedily. She had once had them casually appraised for insurance purposes at over $250,000. She threw the velvet box into her oversized designer handbag, slipped on a pair of large, dark sunglasses to hide her face, and snuck out the back door of the mansion. While Devin was desperately trying to call criminal defense attorneys on an untraceable burner phone downstairs, his loyal wife was hailing a private rideshare car heading straight for the city's exclusive Diamond District. She planned to fence the entire collection for cold hard cash, buy a first-class international ticket, and disappear long before the county sheriff arrived to throw her out on the street. Megan ordered the driver to drop her off 2 blocks away from her actual destination to avoid any security cameras recognizing the vehicle. She walked briskly past the glittering, brightly lit storefronts until she reached a highly discreet, heavily fortified pawn brokerage that catered exclusively to desperate, wealthy clientele. There were no flashing neon signs, only a thick, bulletproof glass door and a massive armed security guard who silently buzzed her inside. The interior smelled of polished mahogany, expensive leather, and old money. She walked confidently up to the reinforced glass counter and dropped the heavy velvet box directly in front of the senior jeweler. She demanded a rapid cash buyout, stating she was going through a messy, high-profile divorce and needed to liquidate her assets quietly without leaving a paper trail. The jeweler, a man who had spent 40 years reading the desperate body language of ruined aristocrats, offered a polite, non-committal nod. He opened the box carefully, lifting the heavy teardrop necklace into the bright halogen light. What Megan did not know, and what Devin had never possessed the intelligence to realize, was the true nature of my wedding gift. When Devin first introduced me to Megan, I saw right through her carefully constructed, innocent facade. I recognized the cold, calculating eyes of a predator looking for a wealthy host to drain. I was a man of substantial means, but I was not a foolish one. I absolutely refused to hand over $250,000 in multi-generational family wealth to a woman who would inevitably destroy my son. So for my formal wedding gift, I commissioned a master jeweler to create an absolute masterpiece of mechanical deception. The stones set in that heavy platinum jewelry were cutting-edge laboratory-grown replicas. To the naked eye, and even to a standard diamond heat tester, they registered as flawless, high-grade gems. But beneath the intense magnification of a high-powered jeweler's microscope, a deeply guarded secret was waiting to be discovered. Microscopic serial numbers were laser-engraved directly onto the girdle of every single major stone in the collection. They were highly specific security tracking numbers. And 10 months ago, right before I legally erased Garrett from existence and became Anton Cole, I took one final crucial administrative step. I filed a highly detailed, comprehensive police report documenting the sudden theft of specific uninsured family heirlooms from my property. I entered every single one of those microscopic laser-engraved serial numbers directly into the National Stolen Property Database. The pawnshop jeweler placed a specialized digital magnifying loupe over his right eye and examined the center stone of the necklace. He adjusted the focus ring, his trained eye immediately catching the tiny string of alphanumeric characters etched into the side of the gem. He did not say a word. He calmly typed the sequence into the secure law enforcement database terminal hidden beneath his counter. The screen instantly flashed a silent, glaring red alert explicitly identifying the pieces as stolen property linked to an unresolved grand larceny case belonging to a deceased estate. The jeweler maintained his impeccable professional composure. He did not accuse her. He did not raise his voice or show any sign of alarm. He simply offered Megan a warm, reassuring smile and gently closed the velvet box, placing his hand over it. He told her that the pieces were of exceptional quality, but due to the sheer size of the requested transaction, he needed to take them into the back secure room to verify the platinum weight and consult his manager for a cash disbursement of that magnitude. He offered her a crystal glass of sparkling water and politely asked her to take a seat on the leather sofa near the front window. Megan, utterly blinded by her own arrogance and the intoxicating anticipation of a massive cash payout, eagerly accepted. She sat down, crossed her legs, and began aggressively typing out a list of international flight options on her phone, completely ignoring the frantic, desperate text messages now flooding in from her terrified husband. She was so absorbed in her selfish escape plan that she completely failed to notice the heavy magnetic lock on the front door engaging with a solid, definitive click. The jeweler had pressed a silent panic button hidden under his desk the exact moment the red alert appeared on his screen. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Megan tapped her expensive designer shoes impatiently against the hardwood floor, huffing in visible annoyance. She stood up, preparing to march to the back room and angrily demand her money. Before she could take a single step, the piercing, aggressive wail of police sirens cut fiercely through the quiet street outside. Flashing red and blue lights reflected wildly off the bulletproof glass windows, illuminating the dark interior of the pawnshop. 2 heavy police cruisers violently mounted the curb, blocking the entrance completely. 4 uniformed officers jumped out, their hands resting securely on their holstered weapons. The jeweler emerged from the back room and pressed a button unlocking the front door to let the officers inside. Megan's jaw dropped in absolute confusion. She demanded to know what was going on, shouting that she was a respected public figure and threatening to sue the store for harassment and false imprisonment. The lead officer stepped forward, holding the velvet box in his hand. He asked her in a cold, authoritative voice to confirm that she had just attempted to sell the contents of the box. Megan proudly confirmed it, arrogantly stating they were a legitimate wedding gift from her wealthy father-in-law. The officer pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He informed her that the jewelry was officially registered in the federal database as stolen property from the estate of a legally deceased individual. He told her she was under arrest for the possession and attempted fencing of stolen goods. Megan screamed a horrible, shrill sound, physically resisting as the officers grabbed her arms and slammed them hard behind her back. The cold metal cuffs snapped tightly shut around her wrists, the sharp clicking sound echoing through the quiet shop. The glamorous, untouchable influencer was violently dragged out of the store in front of a growing crowd of onlookers, her wrists bound in steel, utterly destroyed by the very gift she thought would save her. Megan's release from the county holding cell was a far cry from the glamorous red carpet exits she usually orchestrated for her social media feeds. There were no flashing cameras, no luxury SUVs waiting at the curb with tinted windows, only the harsh fluorescent lights of the downtown precinct and the heavy metallic stench of disinfectant. Devin had managed to secure a predatory bail bond, leveraging the absolute last fractions of credit he could scrape together from a distant, unsuspecting college fraternity brother who had not yet heard about the impending federal tax evasion charges. The ride back to their soon-to-be repossessed mansion was filled with a suffocating, venomous silence. With the federal tax audit completely freezing Devin's corporate assets and Megan facing serious felony charges for attempting to fence stolen property, their legal and financial options were entirely obliterated. The walls of reality were rapidly closing in, threatening to crush them under the weight of their own arrogance. But they were backed into a corner, and desperate narcissistic animals do not surrender, they attack. Unable to fight in a courtroom with frozen bank accounts and unable to maintain their wealthy facade in private, Megan decided to fight in the court of public opinion. She immediately utilized her remaining influencer contacts, calling in every favor she had left, to book a prime television slot on a highly rated sensationalist daytime talk show known for exploiting family tragedies. She saw it as the ultimate escape hatch. If they could spin a compelling enough narrative, they could launch a massive crowdfunding campaign to pay their mounting legal fees and paint themselves as the tragic victims of a massive corporate conspiracy. Within 24 hours of her release from jail, they were sitting on a plush television studio couch, heavily made up by professional stylists, to look exhausted and heartbroken, preparing to broadcast their elaborate lies to millions of sympathetic housewives across the country. The studio audience sat in rapt, breathless silence as the television host leaned forward, her face twisted into a mask of practiced, exaggerated empathy. Megan dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling with expertly rehearsed vulnerability. She looked directly into the main camera lens and began weaving a completely fabricated, incredibly damaging narrative that would have made a seasoned Hollywood screenwriter jealous. She claimed that my sudden disappearance and the subsequent financial ruin of their family were not the result of their own greed, Devon's massive tax fraud, or her own criminal actions at the pawn shop. Instead, she spun a horrific, calculated tale about my rapidly declining mental health. She stated with absolute, unwavering conviction that I had been suffering from severe, undiagnosed dementia for the past 2 years. She painted a vivid picture of a confused, vulnerable, and frightened old man who had been ruthlessly targeted and manipulated by a shadowy group of ruthless corporate scammers. According to Megan's tearful testimony, these faceless criminals had swooped in during my moments of weakness, isolated me from my supposedly loving and devoted family, and tricked my failing mind into signing away the deed to our generational family home. Devon sat next to her, gripping her hand tightly, nodding solemnly as he played the role of the devastated, fiercely protective son to absolute perfection. He took the microphone and told the audience that he had been desperately searching for me, spending every waking moment and every last dime of his own hard-earned money trying to rescue his sick father from these financial predators. He claimed the scammers had hidden behind a fake shell company called the Nadine Trust, deliberately mocking his late mother's sacred memory while they stole the roof from over their heads and drove his family into poverty. They masterfully omitted the forged $300,000 mortgage. They omitted the years of offshore tax evasion. They omitted the stolen jewelry and the impending federal prison sentences. They presented themselves as absolute martyrs, begging the American public for legal defense funds to help them fight the evil corporations, save their home from the impending eviction, and bring their poor, sick father back to safety. The audience gasped in collective horror. The host expressed deep, righteous outrage, and the donation link flashing brightly at the bottom of the television screen began to rapidly accumulate tens of thousands of dollars from gullible, kind-hearted viewers. Devon and Megan thought they had found a brilliant legal loophole. They thought their media pity play was going to save them from the catastrophic consequences of their actions. 50 stories above the bustling, noisy city streets in a sleek, glass-walled conference room that smelled of expensive leather and fresh espresso, I sat in a high-backed executive chair and watched the entire broadcast unfold on a massive wall-mounted monitor. I did not feel a single ounce of anger at their blatant, malicious perjury. I did not feel the sting of betrayal watching my own flesh and blood portray me as a senile, incompetent fool to the entire nation. In fact, a cold, calculated smile slowly crept across my face. In the science of structural engineering, you sometimes have to deliberately apply extreme sustained pressure to a compromised material just to see exactly where it will fracture. Devon and Megan had just applied that pressure to themselves completely unprompted. By publicly claiming I was mentally incompetent and legally kidnapped by the Nadine Trust, they had unknowingly handed me the exact legal leverage I needed to execute the final, devastating phase of my demolition. They had gone on national television and committed documented, undeniable defamation and perjury, all while actively soliciting fraudulent financial donations under false pretenses across state lines. I picked up the sleek silver remote control and muted the television right, as Megan attempted to squeeze out another fake, trembling tear for the cameras. I reached across the polished mahogany table and picked up my smartphone, pressing the encrypted speed dial button for Mr. Hayes. He answered on the very first ring, the faint, rapid sound of keyboard typing echoing in the background of his busy law firm. I told him I had just watched the morning broadcast and asked if he had recorded the entire segment for our files. Hayes chuckled darkly, his voice vibrating with predatory legal anticipation, noting that they had certainly dug their own graves much deeper than he had originally anticipated. I leaned back in my heavy chair, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, feeling the absolute clarity of a man who firmly controls every single variable in the complex equation. I instructed Hayes to immediately contact his associates at the federal level to freeze the newly established crowdfunding accounts through a federal injunction for suspected wire fraud. Then I gave him the final irrevocable order. I told him the trap was completely full, the bait had been taken, and they had just locked themselves tightly inside it. It was time to snap it shut and break the hinges. I told him to file the immediate courtroom injunction and schedule the emergency civil hearing to dispute the mansion's ownership claims they had just made on television. Devin and Megan wanted to meet the faceless evil scammers who had supposedly stolen their house and ruined their lives. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but they were never going to see the wrecking ball coming. The civil courtroom was filled with a tense, expectant energy. Devin and Megan sat at the plaintiff's table dressed impeccably in conservative, muted tones, deliberately chosen to project the image of responsible, grieving family members facing an unjust corporate giant. Megan held a pristine white tissue tightly in her manicured hands, occasionally dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes for the benefit of the courtroom sketch artist and the few local reporters who had managed to slip into the back row after their explosive television interview. They had fully committed to their fabricated dementia narrative. They were absolutely convinced that no judge in the county would ever uphold an eviction notice against a devoted son desperately trying to save his mentally declining father from a faceless predatory real estate trust. Their public defender, a junior attorney whose retainer was paid for by their fraudulent television crowdfunding campaign, confidently arranged his sparse notes on the wooden table. Devin leaned back in his chair, a subtle, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the system. He assumed the mysterious Anton Cole and the Nadine Trust would send a low-level corporate proxy, some faceless junior lawyer they could easily overwhelm with their emotional, highly publicized sob story and their newly acquired public sympathy. When the judge, a stern woman known for her absolute zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, struck her heavy wooden gavel to call the hearing. To order, Devin sat up straight. He was ready to deliver the performance of his life. He was fully prepared to swear under oath that his father was a frail, confused victim of severe elder abuse. He was ready to look a federal judge in the eye and lie through his teeth to save his luxury mansion. The judge adjusted her glasses and asked the defense to state their presence for the official record. The heavy, solid oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open, the brass hinges groaning loudly in the quiet, cavernous space. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. I stepped through the doorway. I was not leaning on a cane. I was not shuffling my feet, and my eyes were certainly not clouded with the pathetic confusion of a deteriorating mind. I walked down the center aisle with the straight, measured, and unyielding posture of a man who had spent his entire adult life commanding massive construction sites and ordering structural demolitions. I was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. My gold retirement watch gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mr. Hayes walked closely at my right side, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my son's future. The smug, confident smirk vanished from Devin's face so fast, it looked as though he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. All the blood instantly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. Megan gasped audibly, dropping her pristine white tissue onto the dirty floor, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer terror. I walked right past their table without giving them a single glance, the sharp click of my leather shoes echoing loudly, and took my seat at the defense table. Mr. Hayes stood up, buttoned his suit jacket with a calm, surgical precision, and clearly introduced me to the court. He stated my name was Anton Cole, formerly known as Garrett, the sole owner, primary benefactor, and acting director of the Nadine Trust. The junior attorney, sitting next to Devin, began frantically whispering to his clients, his eyes wide with panic, desperately trying to understand why the frail, kidnapped dementia patient they had described to him was currently sitting across the aisle looking like a ruthless corporate titan. Devin could not speak. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The terrifying, suffocating reality of the situation was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. The man he had tried to casually throw away was not a victim. I was the architect of his destruction, and I had personally arrived to oversee the final collapse of his life. The judge looked down from her high wooden bench, her sharp eyes darting between my composed posture and Devon's rapidly crumbling facade. She looked directly at Devon's attorney and asked in a dangerously quiet voice if this was the same elderly man they had publicly claimed was mentally incompetent and legally kidnapped. Before the young lawyer could even attempt to stammer out a coherent excuse, Mr. Hayes took the floor. He stated that not only was I in perfect mental and physical health, but I had voluntarily liquidated my own assets and changed my identity specifically to protect myself from severe documented financial abuse perpetrated by my own flesh and blood. Devon jumped out of his chair, blind panic completely overriding his common sense and courtroom decorum. He shouted at the judge that I was lying, that I had been brainwashed by Hayes, and that he was only trying to protect his childhood home from predatory lawyers. The judge violently slammed her gavel down, her voice booming across the room as she threatened Devon with immediate incarceration for contempt of court if he spoke out of turn again. Devon collapsed back into his chair, breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his face. Mr. Hayes did not argue with the outburst. He simply opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. He requested formal permission to submit a digital exhibit directly into the official court record. He explained to the judge that as a career structural engineer, I was deeply passionate about comprehensive home security. Months before I legally changed my name and allowed the commercial developers to demolish my old property, I had installed a series of hidden motion-activated security cameras in my own living room and study. Hayes handed the drive to the court clerk, who plugged it into the courtroom's multimedia system. A large projector screen slowly descended from the ceiling. The video began to play in crystal-clear, high-definition audio and video. It showed Devon and Megan standing in my old living room casually drinking my expensive wine while I was out of town on business. The entire courtroom fell dead silent as Devon's own voice echoed through the high-quality speakers. He was holding a stack of papers explicitly outlining his step-by-step plan to forge my signature on the $300,000 loan documents to bypass the bank's security protocols. But the recording did not stop there. Megan laughed a cold, cruel laugh on the video. She leaned against my fireplace and suggested that once the loan was fully secured and the money was transferred, they should hire a corrupt medical professional to declare me legally incompetent. She casually proposed forcing me into a locked state-run psychiatric ward so they could seize the remainder of my state pension and sell my house without my permission. The entire courtroom listened to them casually, gleefully plot the absolute destruction of my life simply to fund their luxury kitchen upgrades and backyard swimming pool. The video ended abruptly and the screen went black. The silence in the courtroom was so profound you could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioning vents. The judge's face hardened into a mask of pure, righteous fury. She turned her searing, unforgiving gaze directly onto Devon and Megan. They had come into her courtroom seeking unearned pity, expecting to use the legal system as a weapon to steal my property. Instead, they had just been backed into a corner with undeniable high-definition proof of massive financial fraud, felony forgery, and a deliberate conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The judge looked at the terrified junior attorney and asked him very quietly if his clients still wished to pursue their fraudulent claims regarding the property ownership. Megan buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. But this time, the tears were completely real. The trap had snapped entirely shut, completely shattering their defenses and leaving them with absolutely nowhere to run. The heavy silence in the courtroom was suddenly broken by the sharp, desperate sound of Megan violently pushing her chair back. Her tears vanished as quickly as they had appeared, replaced by the feral, cornered look of a predator, realizing it was about to be skinned alive. She completely ignored her junior attorney, who was desperately tugging at the sleeve of her expensive blouse, begging her to sit down and remain quiet. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands onto the heavy wooden table and screamed directly at the judge. If she was going to lose the mansion, she was not going to walk away empty-handed. She loudly declared that regardless of who legally owned the underlying deed to the property, she had personally invested over $150,000 of her own hard-earned sponsorship money into completely renovating the interior. She rapidly listed the imported Italian marble countertops, the custom heated flooring, the massive backyard infinity pool, and the state-of-the-art outdoor kitchen. She demanded a judicial mechanic's lien against the estate. She insisted with absolute screeching arrogance that if she and Devon were going to be evicted, the Nadine Trust was legally obligated to cut her a certified check for her entire financial investment before she handed over the keys. She smugly crossed her arms, her chest heaving, genuinely believing she had just executed a brilliant legal maneuver that would secure her a massive cash payout. The judge lowered her glasses, her expression utterly unreadable, and turned her attention to the defense table. She asked Mr. Hayes if he had any documentation regarding these alleged renovations and the financial claims presented by the plaintiff. Mr. Hayes did not just stand up. He practically glided to his feet, a chilling, predatory smile spreading across his usually stoic face. He told the judge that he was incredibly glad the plaintiff had brought up the extensive luxury renovations. He reached into his seemingly bottomless leather briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of glossy, heavily bound construction contracts. He walked purposefully to the center of the courtroom and handed the primary copy directly to the court clerk. Mr. Hayes spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a professor delivering a final lecture to a failing student. He explained to the court that 6 months ago, Megan had aggressively vetted multiple high-end contracting firms before finally selecting a premier, highly exclusive luxury builder known as Apex Build. She had proudly signed their master service agreement, thrilled by their promise of rapid, discreet, and top-tier architectural upgrades. Hayes slowly turned on his heel to face Megan directly. He asked her to confirm that she had indeed wired exactly $150,000 to Apex Build in 3 separate, non-refundable installments. Megan proudly confirmed it, lifting her chin, stating she had the bank receipts to prove every single penny she invested. Mr. Hayes nodded slowly. He then asked the judge to flip to the final page of the construction contract, specifically pointing to the corporate registration addendum. Apex Build was not an independent contracting firm. It was a fully integrated, wholly owned, subsidiary shell company. And the sole proprietor, the registered corporate officer who legally controlled every single asset and bank account associated with Apex Build, was Anton Cole. The color drained from Megan's face so rapidly she looked as though she might physically faint. Devin, still paralyzed in his chair from the video recording, slowly turned his head to look at his wife, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my face a mask of absolute, unforgiving granite. When they first decided to renovate the mansion using the money my son had fraudulently stolen from my own home, I knew Megan would demand the absolute best contractors in the city. Through my extensive decades-long network in the structural engineering and high-end construction industries, it was incredibly easy to quickly establish Apex Build. I had simply hired a few of my most trusted former foremen, set up a sleek corporate website, and used an intermediary to aggressively market the firm directly to Megan's pretentious social circle. She took the bait without a second thought. Every single time she authorized a wire transfer to pay for her imported marble or her custom infinity pool, she was depositing that money directly into my secure offshore accounts. Mr. Hayes continued his relentless legal assault, his voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. He directed the judge to a highly specific, legally ironclad clause buried deep within the terms and conditions of the Apex Build contract that Megan had eagerly signed without reading. The clause explicitly stated that any and all permanent fixtures, structural upgrades, or custom materials attached to the property remained the sole exclusive legal property of Apex Build until a final, arbitrarily inflated administrative invoice was paid in full. But because the property owner and the construction company were essentially the exact same entity, the legal loop was completely closed. The ultimate payload finally dropped, hitting the plaintiff's table with the destructive force of a tactical missile. Megan had not invested her money into a shared marital asset. She had voluntarily paid $150,000 directly into her father-in-law's pocket to physically upgrade a piece of real estate that he already owned. By her own arrogant admission and validated by her own signature on the binding contracts, she had financed the massive increase in my property's market value using her own cash. She possessed absolutely no equity. She held no legal claim to the marble, the pool, or the custom floors. She had essentially tipped me $150,000 for the privilege of being violently evicted. The judge reviewed the documents carefully, tracing the corporate ownership lines with her silver pen. When she finally looked up, there was not a single shred of judicial sympathy left in her eyes. She slammed her heavy wooden gavel down with a resounding final crack. She dismissed their lawsuit with extreme prejudice, explicitly validating the immediate eviction order and granting the Nadine Trust full, uncontested possession of the estate and all its attached fixtures. She then instructed the court bailiff to forward the hearing transcripts, the signed forged loan documents, and the hidden camera video footage directly to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal review. Megan collapsed heavily against the wooden table, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. She was completely, utterly destitute. She had no home, no emergency funds, no stolen jewelry to pawn, and absolutely no future. She had tried to outsmart an engineer, completely forgetting that I was the one who taught her husband how to count. I stood up, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back, leaving them to drown in the shallow, pathetic graves they had dug for themselves. Following the absolute bloodbath in the courtroom, Devin tried to desperately cling to the only piece of his identity he had left his high-powered career. He left his sobbing wife at the courthouse steps, ignoring her vicious demands to fix the mess, and hailed a taxi straight to the downtown financial district. He convinced himself that if he could just close the upcoming multi-million-dollar tech merger he had been working on for 6 months, he could leverage his massive corporate bonuses to hire a high-powered criminal defense attorney. He needed to outrun the Internal Revenue Service, outrun the district attorney, and outrun the devastating humiliation that was about to hit the public record. But he severely underestimated the speed at which a corporate infection is identified and isolated by a legal professional. In the ultra-competitive world of high-stakes tech investment, rumors are currency and verified scandals are absolute poison. While Devin was sitting in the back of the cab, desperately formulating a fake story to tell his bosses about a simple misunderstanding over a family inheritance, his entire professional world was already being dismantled from the inside out. Mr. Hayes had not stopped working when the judge struck her gavel. A senior partner at a premier law firm knows exactly which strings to pull and exactly who to call to alert the right corporate compliance officers. Minutes after the civil hearing concluded, Hayes had securely transmitted a highly detailed, redacted summary of the judge's findings directly to the legal department of Devin's investment firm. He included the undeniable proof of Devin's federal tax evasion audit, the impending felony forgery charges, and a brief transcript of the elder abuse conspiracy. The corporate machinery reacted with ruthless mechanical efficiency. By the time Devin's taxi pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper, his fate within the company had already been sealed by a unanimous emergency board decision. Devin marched through the sleek marble-floored lobby, adjusting his expensive silk tie and forcing an arrogant, confident smile onto his pale face. He approached the secure executive elevators and swiped his customized platinum keycard against the optical scanner. The machine emitted a harsh, flat buzz. A red light flashed across the sensor. Devin frowned, assuming it was a simple magnetic error, and aggressively swiped the card a second time. The red light flashed again, denying him access to the fortress he thought he commanded. Before he could turn around to yell at the lobby receptionist, 2 massive corporate security guards materialized from the shadows, flanking him tightly on both sides. They did not speak. They simply gestured toward a private service elevator reserved strictly for internal security and building maintenance. Devin's forced smile completely evaporated. A cold, suffocating dread pooled in his stomach as the industrial elevator ascended rapidly to the executive penthouse floor. When the metal doors slid open, he was not escorted to his luxurious corner office. He was marched directly into the center of the firm's primary glass-walled conference room. The entire board of directors was already seated around the massive obsidian table, their faces completely devoid of any professional warmth or collegial respect. The chief executive officer, a man who had personally mentored Devin and publicly praised his aggressive market strategies, sat at the very head of the table. He did not offer Devin a seat. Instead, he slid a thick black leather folder across the polished surface. The CEO spoke with a chilling, detached professionalism that cut straight through Devin's rising panic. He informed Devin that the firm's legal compliance team had just received a highly disturbing dossier detailing massive personal financial fraud, impending federal tax evasion indictments, and explicit undeniable evidence of felony forgery involving a residential mortgage. Devin tried to interrupt, his voice cracking loudly as he desperately attempted to spin the narrative, claiming it was just a bitter family dispute orchestrated by a vengeful father who was trying to ruin him. The CEO raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. He stated that the firm managed billions of dollars in elite client assets and their entire reputation was built on unimpeachable trust and absolute financial integrity. They could not and would not employ an executive who forged loan documents and hid money in offshore accounts to avoid federal taxes. The CEO opened the folder and read directly from a highlighted clause in Devon's employment contract. It was the Morality and Fiduciary Integrity Clause. This was a standard but rarely enforced stipulation that allowed the investment firm to immediately terminate any executive whose personal or professional conduct threatened to bring public disgrace, criminal charges, or regulatory scrutiny upon the company. The CEO looked Devon dead in the eyes and stated that he was being terminated with absolute cause effective immediately. But the nightmare did not end with a simple firing. The true payload of the morality clause struck Devon with the force of a physical blow. Because he was being terminated for cause relating to financial fraud and active criminal investigations, the company was legally exercising its right to completely strip him of his unvested stock options and permanently nullify his accumulated executive bonuses. Over $4 million in future wealth, the very money Devon had been desperately relying on to save his lifestyle, appease his wife, and pay his mounting legal debts, vanished into thin air. He was entirely wiped out in a matter of seconds. The CEO signaled the security guards, instructing them to escort Devon to his desk to collect his personal items under strict supervision and then remove him from the premises permanently. Devon stumbled out of the glass conference room, his legs barely able to support his own weight. Dozens of his former colleagues, junior analysts he had previously bullied, and rival executives stood in the open plan office watching in dead silence as he was marched to his desk. His corporate laptop and company cell phone had already been confiscated by the IT department. A single cheap cardboard box sat empty on his pristine desk. With trembling hands, Devon packed a few framed photographs, a personalized coffee mug, and a decorative desk clock. The security guards stood uncomfortably close, ensuring he did not touch a single company document or access any filing cabinets. He picked up the pathetic cardboard box, the physical weight of his total failure pressing down on his chest. He walked back to the elevators, his head bowed in absolute disgrace, listening to the quiet murmurs and stifled laughs of the people he used to command. He was pushed out through the revolving glass doors of the lobby and onto the busy, unforgiving city sidewalk. He had no job. He had no future income. He had absolutely no stock options to fall back on. The arrogant, untouchable tech director was now completely bankrupt, standing alone in the middle of the financial district, clutching a cardboard box filled with worthless trinkets, while the world moved on without him. Devon walked through the heavy front doors of the mansion, the cardboard box from his office slipping from his numb fingers and crashing onto the imported marble floor. The house was already dying. The grand foyer, once filled with the obnoxious sounds of their lavish parties, was now suffocatingly silent and partially stripped. Megan had wasted no time after fleeing the courthouse. Half the designer luggage she owned was piled near the staircase, stuffed with whatever luxury items she could cram inside before the sheriff arrived the next morning. When she heard the dull thud of his box hitting the floor, she appeared at the top of the stairs, her face a twisted mask of absolute contempt. She looked down at the pathetic man she had married, taking in his disheveled suit and the empty look in his eyes. She did not ask him how his day went. She did not ask him if he had secured a lawyer. She marched down the curved staircase and immediately began screaming, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. She blamed him for the humiliating loss in court. She blamed him for the impending eviction. She demanded to know how a supposed financial genius could be so easily outsmarted by a retired engineer. Devon felt a dark, venomous rage boiling up in his chest. He snapped. He screamed right back at her, his voice hoarse and desperate. He told her about his brutal termination, the complete loss of his unvested stock options, and the humiliating walkout of the firm. He blamed her endless, insatiable greed for forcing him to forge the loan documents in the first place. The walls of the mansion shook as the two cornered animals tore into each other, stripping away the thin veneer of their marriage to reveal the absolute rot underneath. The shouting match escalated from bitter insults to vicious legal threats. Devon backed Megan against the hallway wall, his finger pointing aggressively inches from her face. He told her that she was not going to simply pack her bags and walk away from the massive crater she helped dig. He reminded her of the brutal Internal Revenue Service audit currently freezing all their assets. With a cruel, desperate smile, he promised her that when the federal agents dragged him into the interrogation room, he was going to sing like a bird. He swore he would testify that she was fully aware of the hidden offshore accounts, that she actively spent the untaxed money to fund her extravagant lifestyle influencer brand, and that she had willingly signed their fraudulent joint tax returns for 3 consecutive years. He threatened to drag her right down into a federal prison cell right next to his. He expected her to break down, to cry, to beg for a coordinated defense strategy. Instead, Megan let out a sharp, humorless laugh that sent a chill straight down Devon's spine. The panic completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a true predator. She pushed past him, walked calmly into his lavish home office, and booted up her own sleek silver laptop. She told him that she had never trusted him. She told him that from the very first year of their marriage, she had made it a habit to silently monitor his home network traffic, just in case he ever decided to hide money from her or fund a mistress. Devon followed her into the office, his heart hammering against his ribs, demanding to know what she was talking about. Megan opened a deeply encrypted folder on her desktop and turned the screen toward him. Devon's breath caught in his throat. Displayed in high definition were exact, unedited copies of his most secretive corporate ledgers. These were not just the records of his offshore tax evasion. These were the highly confidential, internal accounting bypasses he had built at his tech investment firm. He had been quietly skimming fractions of percentages off massive client mergers for years, funneling the stolen corporate funds into his own pockets before transferring them overseas. It was undeniable proof of massive systematic corporate embezzlement. Megan leaned casually against the heavy oak desk, her fingers hovering delicately over the laptop's keyboard. She looked at her husband's terrified, pale face and smiled a truly wicked smile. She explained that while he was busy forging his father's signature to buy her a swimming pool, she was busy building the ultimate insurance policy. Devon lunged forward, desperately reaching for the computer, begging her to close the laptop. He frantically promised he would take all the blame for the tax fraud. He promised he would never mention her name to the federal agents. He promised her absolutely anything if she would just delete those files. But Megan was completely done negotiating with a bankrupt man. She told him he was no longer a husband or a provider. He was just a massive liability. With a single sharp click of her perfectly manicured finger, she hit the send button. Devon watched in absolute horror as the progress bar flashed across the screen, attaching the massive, devastating zip file of his embezzlement ledgers to a direct encrypted email. The recipient address was unmistakably clear. It was the official intake portal for the county district attorney's office, specifically the division handling major white-collar corporate crimes. The screen chimed cheerfully, indicating the message had been successfully delivered. Megan slammed the laptop shut and slipped it into her oversized designer bag. She looked down at him one last time, her voice dripping with pure ice. She told him that the Internal Revenue Service might take years to build a tax evasion case, but the district attorney would have a federal arrest warrant issued for corporate embezzlement before breakfast. She turned on her heel and walked out of the office, leaving Devon collapsing to his knees on the expensive rug. What started as a simple civil dispute over a forged mortgage and a stolen house had just violently mutated into a massive federal criminal indictment. I had built the framework for their destruction, but I never had to push them off the ledge. When you corner a pair of greedy, selfish parasites, you do not need to lift a finger to destroy them. You just lock the door and let them eat each other alive. Megan did not waste a single second watching her husband shatter into a million irreparable pieces on the floor of his home office. She had successfully detonated the explosive charge that would undoubtedly send Devon to a federal penitentiary, and now it was time for her to evacuate the blast radius. She sprinted up the sweeping mahogany staircase, her high heels sinking deeply into the plush, expensive carpet she would never walk on again. Inside the master bedroom, 3 massive designer trunks were already open and half filled from her earlier panic. She bypassed the heavy winter coats and the bulky items, focusing entirely on maximum financial density. She packed rare silk dresses, limited edition leather handbags, and custom designer sunglasses. Anything that could be easily carried and quickly sold for cash on the European black market went straight into the bags. She had absolutely no intention of sticking around to face the district attorney, the Internal Revenue Service, or the county sheriff, who was scheduled to arrive the very next morning with the eviction notice. Furthermore, she had zero intention of facing the local judge for her pending felony grand larceny charges regarding the stolen jewelry. She was a woman who had lived her entire adult life firmly believing consequences were exclusively meant for poor people. She walked over to her vanity mirror, grabbed a silver nail file, and pried open a hidden wooden compartment behind the bottom drawer. She pulled out a sleek, solid black credit card. It was a high-limit offshore corporate card she had secretly established under her mother's maiden name 3 years ago, completely detached from Devon's currently frozen financial network. With shaking but determined hands, she pulled out her phone, navigated a private browser, and booked a one-way first-class ticket on the next available overnight flight to Geneva, Switzerland. She knew several wealthy expatriates living there who would happily take her in while she figured out her next manipulative move. She zipped the heavy trunks shut, adjusted her oversized dark sunglasses to hide her face, and called for an exclusive private car service. She left the front door of the mansion wide open, abandoning her weeping husband to the ruins of his own life without a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. The ride to the international airport took less than 40 minutes, but to Megan it felt like an agonizing eternity. She sat rigidly in the back of the luxurious black SUV, compulsively checking the rearview mirror, terrified that federal agents or local police cruisers were suddenly going to appear through the darkness to drag her back to the nightmare. But the highway remained completely clear. When the vehicle finally pulled up to the brightly lit curbside of the International Departure Terminal, a wave of profound, intoxicating relief washed over her. She tipped the driver generously with a crisp $100 bill, grabbed the thick leather handles of her designer trunks, and walked through the sliding glass doors with the arrogant, unbothered stride of a woman who genuinely believed she had successfully outsmarted the universe. She bypassed the massive winding lines of exhausted economy travelers and walked directly into the expedited, exclusive first-class security lane. She placed her expensive bags onto the conveyor belt with a dismissive flick of her wrist, completely ignoring the mundane instructions of the security staff. She felt utterly untouchable. She pictured herself sipping expensive vintage champagne in a lie-flat leather seat, flying thousands of miles away from the mess she had created, leaving Devin and me to fight over the pathetic scraps of a destroyed estate. She stepped up to the elevated podium and confidently handed her pristine dark blue passport to the Uniformed Transportation Security Administration agent. The agent, a stern-looking woman with tired eyes, opened the booklet and placed it face down onto the glowing optical scanner. For a brief second, the machine hummed quietly, processing the complex biometric data. Then the standard green approval light failed to illuminate. Instead, the terminal screen flashed a brilliant, violent red. A sharp, high-pitched electronic alarm beeped 3 times in rapid succession, echoing loudly across the quiet first-class screening area. The agent's bored expression instantly vanished, replaced by a tense, highly alert professional stare. She did not hand the passport back. She placed her hand firmly over the document, stepped back from the podium, and picked up a heavy black radio attached to her shoulder. She spoke a string of numerical codes into the microphone, keeping her eyes locked directly on Megan. The arrogant smirk completely melted off Megan's face. She leaned forward, her voice trembling slightly, demanding to know what the problem was and insisting she had a very expensive international flight to catch. The agent did not answer her. She simply raised her hand, signaling Megan to step out of the line and stand to the side. An engineer knows that when a massive structure begins to fail, the occupants will always run blindly for the nearest exit. You do not just orchestrate the collapse, you must also securely bolt the fire doors shut. Before Megan could throw a calculated tantrum or demand to speak to an airport supervisor, heavy footsteps echoed rapidly across the polished floor. 3 massive, heavily armed officers from the United States Customs and Border Protection Agency materialized from a side security door, surrounding her in a tight, impenetrable triangle. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern, unforgiving face, asked her to formally confirm her full legal identity. Megan stammered the cold reality of the situation, finally piercing her grand delusion. The officer informed her that her passport had been officially flagged and completely invalidated for international travel. He explained that her blatant attempt to flee the country violated the strict bail conditions set by the county judge following her arrest at the pawn shop. But that was only the very beginning of her travel restrictions. The officer pulled a folded, heavily stamped legal document from his tactical vest and handed it directly to her. It was a rapid emergency writ, an aggressive civil debt injunction filed mere hours ago by none other than Mr. Hayes. Following the catastrophic civil court ruling that afternoon, Hayes had immediately petitioned the federal courts. He successfully demonstrated that Megan was an extreme flight risk who owed massive court-ordered financial restitution to the Nadine Trust for her active role in the property fraud, combined with the impending legal fees and punitive damages she had just incurred by filing a frivolous, fraudulent lien against my property. The judge had eagerly signed the emergency travel ban, placing a hard lock on her social security number and her passport across all federal and international travel databases. The officer looked at her coldly and stated clearly that she was legally barred from leaving the state of jurisdiction until every single penny of her massive civil debts was paid in full and until her pending felony criminal trials were completely resolved. She was not going to Geneva. She was not getting on an airplane at all. The officers grabbed her designer luggage from the conveyor belt, took her firmly by the arms, and marched her away from the departure gates, escorting her directly toward the airport security holding cells for attempting to jump bail. Megan looked wildly around the terminal, her breathing shallow and frantic. The glittering illusion of her wealthy jet-setting lifestyle vanished into thin air, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of her existence. She was entirely broke, facing multiple felony indictments, and heavily indebted to the very father-in-law she had casually tried to destroy. She was physically and legally trapped inside the very city she had just tried to abandon, a desperate rat caught permanently inside a maze of my meticulous design with absolutely no exits left to find. Devin was left entirely alone in the echoing, empty grand foyer of his mansion, staring blankly at the open front door where his wife had just vanished. The crushing silence of the massive house was soon broken by the relentless, sharp ringing of his cell phone. It was not Megan calling to apologize or reconsider her hasty departure. It was a junior clerk from the county district attorney's office, formally notifying him that a federal warrant for his arrest regarding the massive corporate embezzlement charges would be executed within 48 hours. The walls of his carefully constructed reality were rapidly closing in, leaving him absolutely nowhere to hide. Stripped of his high-paying executive job, abandoned by his calculating wife, publicly disgraced in civil court, and facing a massive federal criminal indictment, Devin resorted to the very last pathetic option he had left. He picked up his phone with violently trembling hands and called Mr. Hayes. He wept openly into the receiver, abandoning every single shred of his former corporate arrogance, and begged the lawyer to arrange a private face-to-face meeting with his father. He pleaded that it was a matter of life and death, desperately insisting that if I would just sit down and listen to him for a few minutes, he could explain everything and make amends for his terrible mistakes. To Devin's genuine surprise, Hayes did not laugh or hang up on him. Hayes calmly placed him on a brief hold, returning a few moments later to state that Anton Cole would agree to a single 15-minute meeting. The location was set for the following afternoon at a neutral, highly secure facility. Devin arrived 2 full hours early, pacing nervously outside a sterile, windowless conference room located deep within a corporate arbitration center downtown. The room was aggressively bare, containing only a cold steel table and 2 heavy metal chairs. There were no comfortable leather sofas, no expensive artwork, and no warm mahogany panels to soften the brutal blow of reality. I walked into the room exactly on time, dressed in a sharp, perfectly tailored black suit, carrying nothing but a small digital audio recorder. I sat down at the table, folded my hands neatly, and looked at the broken, ruined man sitting across from me. Devin looked completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, untouchable tech director who had swaggered through my living room less than a year ago. His expensive designer suit was heavily wrinkled and hung loosely on his rapidly thinning frame. He had not shaved in days, and deep dark purple circles bruised the skin under his bloodshot, terrified eyes. The exact moment the heavy steel door clicked securely shut behind me, Devin completely shattered. He did not attempt to negotiate a settlement or offer a professional legal defense. He slid out of his metal chair and dropped directly onto his knees on the hard, unforgiving linoleum floor. He crawled forward, desperately trying to grab my hands, but I smoothly pulled them back, resting them firmly on the edge of the cold table, entirely out of his reach. He buried his face in his arms and began to sob, a loud, wet, pathetic sound echoing harshly off the bare acoustic walls. He begged for my forgiveness, his voice cracking and hitching as he desperately swore that he had completely changed. He claimed that the immense wealth, the extreme pressure of the corporate environment, and the toxic social circles had completely poisoned his mind. He spun a pathetic narrative insisting that Megan had viciously manipulated his personal vulnerabilities to force him into making terrible financial decisions against his will. He promised that if I would just call off the district attorney, drop the civil injunctions, and release the funds to pay for his criminal legal defense, he would dedicate the rest of his natural life to making me proud. He swore he would check into a rehabilitation center, attend intense psychological therapy, and rebuild our broken family bond from scratch. I sat perfectly still, observing his desperate performance with the clinical, detached precision of a scientist studying a dying organism under a microscope. There was absolutely no warmth left in my chest, no sudden surge of paternal instinct urging me to reach down and comfort my crying child. I simply saw a cornered, desperate parasite trying to latch back onto its primary host to survive the winter. When his endless tears and frantic apologies failed to elicit a single flinch of sympathy from me, Devon resorted to his absolute lowest, most manipulative weapon. He looked up, his face slick with cold sweat and tears, and invoked the sacred memory of his late mother. He choked out Nadine's name, insisting that she would be completely heartbroken to see her only son destroyed like this. He pleaded that for her sake, for the profound love I still held for the woman who gave birth to him, I had to show him mercy. He whispered that Nadine had always believed in second chances, and that she would never want her family torn apart by a cold, calculating legal dispute. It was a vile, desperate tactic, intentionally weaponizing the deepest, most painful grief of my life in a pathetic attempt to save himself from a federal prison cell. My expression remained absolutely stone cold. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse at him. And I did not let the intense, burning anger show on my face for even a fraction of a second. Instead, I calmly picked up the small digital audio recorder from the table. I looked directly into Devon's desperate, pleading eyes and pressed the play button. The pristine, high-definition audio quality filled the sterile conference room instantly. It was a recording taken from the hidden security cameras in my old house, captured exactly 1 year ago, long before I had ever discovered the forged mortgage documents or the hidden offshore tax evasion accounts. In the recording, Devon was pacing angrily in my living room, talking on his cell phone to Megan about my firm refusal to prematurely liquidate my state pension to buy them a luxury vacation home. Devon's recorded voice was laced with pure, unadulterated venom. The cruel, selfish words echoed loudly off the cold steel walls, perfectly preserving his true nature. The old man is a stubborn fool. If he would just die, we wouldn't have to jump through these hoops to get what is rightfully ours anyway. Devon froze on his knees, his jaw dropping open, the fake manipulative tears instantly drying on his pale cheeks. The horrifying reality of his own recorded words paralyzed him completely. He could not blame Megan for that statement. He could not blame corporate stress. It was his own voice casually wishing for my death simply to accelerate his inheritance. I pressed the stop button, plunging the room back into a suffocating, heavy silence. I slowly stood up from the metal chair, carefully buttoning my black suit jacket, looking down at the pathetic creature cowering on the floor. I told him never to speak Nadine's name again. I told him that the son Nadine and I lovingly raised the boy who used to know the true value of hard work and genuine family loyalty, died the exact moment he uttered those words in my living room. I stated with absolute, unwavering finality that I was no longer a father looking at a son. I was merely the structural engineer methodically dismantling the toxic wreckage of a condemned building to ensure it never hurt anyone else again. I pushed my chair in, turned my back on him, and walked steadily toward the heavy steel door. Devon reached out, screaming my name, begging me not to leave him alone in the dark. I did not stop. I opened the door and stepped out into the brightly lit corridor, leaving him locked inside the sterile room to wait for the federal marshals to arrive. The demolition was nearly complete, and there was absolutely nothing left to salvage. The transition from the sterile, windowless conference room to the towering federal courthouse was a blur of humiliating administrative processing for Devon. The federal criminal trial did not feature the dramatic emotional outbursts or the desperate theatrical performances of his previous civil hearings. Federal courts operate with the cold, mechanical, and terrifying efficiency of an industrial meat grinder, and Devon was now firmly positioned right in the teeth of the gears. He sat alone at the heavy wooden defense table, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit provided by the county lockup. His posture was completely slumped, his shoulders heavily rounded, completely stripped of the arrogant tech executive swagger that used to define his entire personality. The massive mahogany-paneled courtroom felt like a cavernous tomb. Across the center aisle, the Assistant United States Attorney stood confidently at her podium. She was a sharply dressed, utterly ruthless prosecutor who had built a formidable career on dissecting arrogant white-collar criminals. She did not need to rely on shaky witness testimony, emotional appeals, or circumstantial assumptions. She was armed with a mountain of irrefutable, meticulously cataloged paper trails. She opened her opening statement to the judge by seamlessly linking Devon's two separate lives of crime, painting a flawless picture of a man driven by insatiable greed. First, she presented the high-definition video footage and the forensic handwriting analysis detailing the massive $300,000 residential mortgage forgery. She explicitly outlined how Devon had casually plotted to steal his own father's home to fund luxury swimming pools and imported marble countertops. Then, without missing a single beat, she dropped the absolute payload. She projected the deeply encrypted corporate ledgers that Megan had spitefully emailed to the district attorney's office. The prosecutor clearly demonstrated how Devon had casually siphoned millions of dollars from elite corporate clients through offshore shell accounts to fund his wife's extravagant influencer lifestyle. Devon had absolutely no defense. He had no wealthy friends left to vouch for his character, and he had no high-priced legal team to bury the court in procedural paperwork. He was entirely exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal justice system. Devon's court-appointed public defender was an exhausted, significantly overworked attorney carrying an active caseload of over 100 desperate clients. The lawyer knew he was looking at an unwinnable, absolute lost cause the exact second he reviewed the initial discovery files provided by the prosecution. However, bound by his professional ethical duty to his client, the public defender requested a brief judicial recess to desperately attempt to negotiate a last-minute plea agreement. Out in the cramped, poorly lit hallway outside the main courtroom doors, the public defender practically begged the district attorney for a reduced sentence. He argued that Devon was a first-time offender, a man who had simply succumbed to the intense, overwhelming financial pressure of his high-stakes corporate environment and the relentless demands of a highly manipulative, materialistic wife. The defense attorney offered a full, unconditional confession from Devon, along with complete cooperation in recovering any remaining offshore funds in exchange for a placement in a minimum security facility and a severely reduced prison term. The district attorney did not even blink. She completely rejected the offer without a second of hesitation, stating plainly that she did not need Devon's cooperation to secure a massive conviction. The evidence was simply too absolute. When I had compiled the initial tax evasion whistleblower dossier 10 months prior, I did not just print out standard bank statements. With the exact same rigorous, obsessive attention to detail that I used to calculate the load-bearing capacity of a commercial skyscraper, I had systematically mapped out every single digital node of Devon's hidden financial network. My hired digital specialist had captured the exact IP addresses Devon used to access the offshore accounts perfectly, cross-referencing them with his corporate laptop's internal network connection logs. Furthermore, the corporate embezzlement ledgers Megan had provided perfectly matched the exact dates, times, and amounts of the fraudulent international wire transfers. The paper trail was an unbreakable titanium chain. The public defender returned to the defense table, his shoulders heavily slumped in defeat. He leaned over and whispered the devastating truth directly into Devon's ear. There would be absolutely no plea deal. There would be no leniency, no mercy, and no escape. The prosecution was going to present every single piece of evidence directly to the judge, and they were going to ask for the absolute maximum penalty allowed under federal sentencing guidelines. Devon buried his face in his trembling hands, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He finally understood the terrifying efficiency of the trap he had so casually stepped into. He had always genuinely believed he was the smartest person in any room, a brilliant financial strategist who could easily manipulate the legal system and outsmart his own elderly father. But he was completely outmatched by the cold, calculating logic of an engineer who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to build structures that absolutely could not fail. The remainder of the federal trial moved with terrifying speed, because Devon's attorney could not offer any factual dispute to the financial ledgers, the IP addresses, or the high-definition video recording of the forgery conspiracy. The defense rested its case entirely without calling a single witness to the stand. The federal judge, a stern, imposing man with decades of experience handling corporate corruption, did not require a lengthy deliberation. He ordered Devon to stand up and face the high wooden bench for formal sentencing. The massive courtroom was completely silent save for the quiet, nervous shuffling of Devon's cheap dress shoes against the carpet. The judge looked down at the ruined man with an expression of profound, undisguised disgust. He stated clearly for the official record that white-collar crime was not a victimless offense. He aggressively admonished Devon for utilizing his extreme privilege, his elite education, and his corporate power to systematically steal from trusting clients, cheat the federal government, and ruthlessly exploit his own flesh and blood. The judge declared that such calculated predatory behavior required a severe and uncompromising punishment to serve as a permanent deterrent to others. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp, violent crack echoing like a gunshot through the silent room. Devon was formally sentenced to exactly 60 months, 5 full years in a federal penitentiary. The crushing sentence covered multiple consecutive counts of felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft relating to the forged mortgage documents. There would be no possibility of early parole, and he was ordered to pay millions in financial restitution that he could never possibly earn back. Immediately following the pronouncement, the judge ordered the federal marshals to remand the defendant into state custody. Two massive, heavily armed marshals stepped forward, flanking Devin tightly on either side. They instructed him in flat, authoritative voices to place his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly shut around his wrists officially severed his final connection to the outside world. All the massive wealth, the unearned arrogance, the imported sports cars, and the luxury mansions were permanently gone. Devin was suddenly nothing more than another designated number in the massive federal prison system. As the marshals forcefully turned him around to lead him toward the secure holding cells at the back of the courtroom, Devin desperately scanned the empty wooden benches of the public gallery. He was searching wildly for a sympathetic face, looking for the mother he had disrespected, looking for the wife who had abandoned him, looking for the father he had tried to destroy. But the benches were completely bare. He was walking directly into the darkest, most terrifying chapter of his life entirely alone, carrying the crushing, inescapable weight of his own complete destruction on his shoulders. After the humiliating ordeal at the airport customs holding cell, Megan was finally released back onto the unforgiving city streets. She had been stripped of her passport, her hidden offshore credit card had been flagged and confiscated as evidence, and her designer luggage remained locked in a police evidence room. She was wearing the same wrinkled clothes she had worn during her frantic escape attempt. Standing on the curb outside the downtown precinct, she counted the crumpled paper bills she had hidden in her coat pocket. It was barely enough for a standard taxi fare. But Megan, ever the delusional narcissist, refused to accept the absolute finality of her ruin. She convinced herself that this was merely a temporary setback. She still had her wealthy, socially prominent parents. They lived in an exclusive gated community on the affluent north side of the city. She firmly believed that once she arrived at their sprawling estate, her father would immediately hire an army of elite defense attorneys to crush the district attorney and tear up Mr. Hayes's civil injunctions. She assumed her mother would draw her a hot bath order, a private chef to prepare her favorite meal, and soothe her bruised ego. She flagged down a passing cab, gave the driver the prestigious address, and spent the entire ride rehearsing a tearful, victimized speech. She planned to place the entire blame for the financial fraud, the stolen jewelry, and the media humiliation squarely onto Devin's shoulders. She was ready to play the role of the innocent, traumatized daughter who had been ruthlessly manipulated by a criminal husband. The taxi dropped her off at the edge of the manicured, tree-lined street. Megan walked confidently up to the massive wrought iron security gates of her parents' estate and pressed the polished brass intercom button. She expected the heavy gates to swing open instantly. Instead, the intercom crackled with dead static and the gates remained firmly shut. Several agonizing minutes passed. Finally, the heavy wooden front door of the main house opened, but her parents did not rush down the long paved driveway with open arms. They walked slowly, their posture rigid, their faces locked in expressions of absolute chilling disgust. Her father, a man whose entire identity was built on his pristine corporate reputation and country club standing, stopped 2 feet away from the iron bars. Her mother stood right beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, refusing to even make eye contact with her daughter. Megan reached through the bars, her voice cracking as she begged them to open the gate and let her inside. Her father looked at her with eyes as cold as jagged ice. He told her in a low, furious whisper that news of Devin's federal prison sentence and her own humiliating arrest at the pawn shop had been plastered across the front page of every local newspaper and gossip blog in the city. The media had exposed their fraudulent television crowdfunding campaign and their despicable lies to the entire nation. Her father stated unequivocally that he would not allow a convicted felon's wife, a woman actively under federal investigation for fencing stolen property, to drag his pristine business empire into the mud. Federal investigators were already circling Devin's associates, and her father absolutely refused to let them audit his own massive wealth. He told her she was a profound, irredeemable embarrassment. Her mother stepped forward and pushed a cheap, unbranded canvas suitcase through the narrow gap in the iron gate. Megan unzipped it frantically, expecting to find stacks of emergency cash or one of her father's premium credit cards. Instead, she found a few pairs of plain, inexpensive sweatpants, basic cotton shirts, and a cheap drugstore toothbrush. There was no money. There were no phones. Her mother looked her dead in the eye and delivered the final devastating blow. She told Megan that she had made her bed with a criminal, and now she had to lie in it completely alone. They turned their backs on her, walked up the long driveway, and firmly locked the heavy front door of the estate. Megan stood frozen on the pristine sidewalk, clutching the cheap canvas bag, entirely unable to comprehend the absolute rejection. She had been completely excommunicated from the only world she had ever known. The sky above her darkened rapidly, heavy charcoal gray clouds rolling in from the coast. A sharp freezing rain began to fall, soaking through her thin designer blouse and plastering her hair to her face. With no money for another taxi and absolutely no friends willing to answer her calls, she was forced to endure a humiliating, grueling journey on the public city bus system. She rode for hours, shivering violently in the damp, cold seats, surrounded by the exact type of working-class people she had spent her entire life mocking on the internet. She had only one destination left. She clung to a desperate, irrational hope that if she could just get back to the mansion, she could barricade herself inside claim squatters' rights and figure out a new survival plan. The bus dropped her off a mile away from her neighborhood, forcing her to drag the cheap suitcase through the relentless, freezing downpour. Her feet were blistered, her makeup was completely washed away, and her muscles ached with a deep, hollow exhaustion. She finally turned the corner onto her street, her eyes desperately seeking the familiar silhouette of her sprawling custom home. But the property was completely illuminated by the harsh, sweeping red and blue lights of county sheriff cruisers. The 72-hour eviction window had officially expired that morning. Megan dropped her bag on the wet asphalt and watched in absolute horror as a team of armed deputies oversaw a professional locksmith drilling the custom brass locks out of the massive front doors. A moving crew was casually tossing the last of her expensive furniture and designer rugs into the back of a large commercial truck to be sold off to satisfy the massive civil debts she owed to the Nadine Trust. She ran toward the driveway, screaming hysterically that she lived there, demanding they stop immediately. A massive sheriff's deputy stepped directly into her path, placing a heavy hand on her wet shoulder, physically stopping her from taking another step onto the property. He looked down at her pathetic, soaked figure and informed her that the estate legally belonged to a private trust. He warned her that if she stepped foot on the driveway, she would be immediately arrested for criminal trespassing and sent straight back to the county jail. She looked past the deputy, staring at the warm, glowing lights of the beautiful mansion she had sacrificed her entire marriage and freedom to build. It was completely gone. She had no husband to manipulate, no parents to bail her out, no followers to beg for money, and absolutely no home to return to. The deputy pointed his flashlight down the dark, rain-swept street, ordering her to move along. Megan picked up the cheap canvas bag, turned her back on the mansion, and walked blindly into the freezing, relentless storm entirely alone, in a world that no longer had any use for her. 6 months ground by with the slow, agonizing friction of rusted gears. For Megan, the rapid, terrifying freefall from her luxurious pedestal had finally ended with a brutal, bone-shattering impact on the absolute bottom floor of society. The glamorous, untouchable internet influencer who once scoffed at anything lacking a designer label was completely dead and buried. In her place stood a thoroughly defeated, exhausted woman working the grueling overnight shift at a heavily franchised, greasy fast food drive-thru on the bleak industrial outskirts of the city. Her carefully curated aesthetic was entirely destroyed. The expensive imported silk dresses had been replaced by a stiff, heavily stained polyester uniform that smelled permanently of burnt frying oil and cheap cleaning chemicals. Her perfectly manicured nails were chipped, bitten down to the quick and stained yellow from scrubbing industrial grills. Her glowing, expensive skincare routine was a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of deep exhaustion lines and the pale, sickly pallor of someone who lived entirely on leftover French fries and tap water. She spent her nights wearing a heavy plastic headset, her ears ringing with the static-filled demands of impatient, rude customers who treated her with the exact same disdain she used to reserve for the working class. She was no longer a person of consequence. She was merely a nameless, faceless drone handing paper bags through a sliding glass window in the freezing cold. But the physical degradation of her minimum wage existence was nothing compared to the absolute suffocating financial torture she endured every single week. Earning minimum wage is a grueling survival test for anyone but for Megan. It was a profound exercise in absolute futility. She did not actually get to keep the meager wages she broke her back to earn. Mr. Hayes and the relentless legal machinery of the Nadine Trust were exceptionally thorough. Following the catastrophic civil judgment that held her personally liable for the massive financial restitution, legal fees, and punitive damages, Hayes had secured an aggressive maximum capacity wage garnishment order. The moment Megan's bi-weekly paycheck was processed by the fast food corporation's payroll department, the county court system automatically intercepted it. They ruthlessly sliced away 70% of her disposable income, legally siphoning the money directly into the accounts of the Nadine Trust before a single penny ever reached her pathetic newly opened checking account. She was left with barely enough loose change to rent a damp, windowless room in a decaying boarding house and purchase a weekly bus pass. Desperation drove her to revert to her deceptive nature. She began actively begging for cash tips from sympathetic drive-through customers, quietly hiding the crumpled dollar bills inside her polyester socks to keep them completely off the books. She thought she was being clever, successfully hiding a few extra dollars from the crushing legal debt. But an engineer never leaves a structural vulnerability unmonitored. Hayes had anticipated her deceptive maneuvers. He utilized the aggressive terms of the civil judgment to file a motion for random, unannounced forensic audits of her living expenses and cash flow. Court-appointed financial auditors would unexpectedly demand access to her boarding house room, examining her meager grocery receipts and cross-referencing her lifestyle with her declared fast food income. When the auditor discovered a small hidden stash of cash taped underneath her mattress, the legal hammer fell with terrifying speed. She was dragged back into a sterile county courtroom where a furious judge threatened her with immediate incarceration for contempt of court and the active concealment of assets to defraud a primary creditor. She was explicitly warned that every single dollar she received, whether in a paycheck or a crumpled tip, legally belonged to the Nadine Trust until her massive debt was fully satisfied. Megan finally realized the terrifying permanence of her situation. She was not just broke. She had become an indentured servant permanently tethered to the very father-in-law she had casually tried to throw into a psychiatric ward. She was working grueling, humiliating hours simply to pay off the marble floors and the infinity pool she no longer had access to. The sheer, inescapable weight of her reality crushed the last remaining embers of her arrogance. She stopped fighting. She stopped trying to hide money. She simply existed, a hollow shell of a woman mechanically going through the motions of a ruined life. It was a bleak, freezing Tuesday morning when the final nail was driven into the coffin of her pride. A heavy layer of gray frost coated the asphalt of the drive-through lane. Megan was shivering in her thin polyester jacket, staring blankly at the digital cash register, waiting for her shift to end. The proximity sensor chimed sharply in her headset. A sleek, perfectly polished black town car glided smoothly up to the illuminated menu board. The vehicle was a stark, jarring contrast to the rusted pickup trucks and cheap sedans that usually populated the lane. The driver did not hesitate or ask for a moment to look at the menu. A calm, familiar voice crackled through the cheap speaker system, ordering a single, simple black coffee. Megan's heart skipped a heavy beat. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands instantly beginning to tremble over the plastic register keys. She punched in the order, her mind frantically praying that her exhausted ears were just playing cruel tricks on her. She watched the camera monitor as the heavy black vehicle pulled slowly forward, stopping perfectly aligned with her sliding glass window. The tinted rear passenger window rolled down with a smooth, silent hum. I sat in the luxurious leather back seat, dressed in an immaculate dark wool overcoat. I looked completely rested, entirely in control, and absolutely untouched by the destruction I had unleashed upon her life. Megan froze completely, her hand hovering over the paper cup of cheap coffee. All the blood drained from her pale face. She expected me to gloat. She expected a cruel smile, a vicious insult, or a boastful remark about how I had successfully destroyed her marriage and stolen her future. But I gave her absolutely nothing to fight against. I did not mock her. I did not smile. My expression remained a mask of cold, analytical precision. I reached out and handed her a crisp, newly minted $100 bill to pay for the $2 coffee. Her trembling, grease-stained fingers instinctively took the money. She stood there completely paralyzed, staring at the face of the man she had so deeply underestimated. I looked her dead in the eyes, ensuring she felt the absolute crushing weight of my presence. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, undeniable authority of a man closing a ledger for the final time. Keep the change. You have a debt to pay." I did not wait for a response. I pressed a button on the armrest, and the tinted glass smoothly rolled back up, completely severing our connection. The heavy town car pulled smoothly out of the drive-through lane, merging seamlessly into the morning city traffic, leaving her entirely alone in the freezing cold. The utter lack of anger in my voice, the casual dismissive pity of the $100 tip completely shattered the final fragile piece of her psychological armor. She could not pretend she was a victim anymore. She could not pretend she was fighting a noble war against an evil corporation. She was just a cruel, greedy woman who had picked a fight with a superior mind and lost absolutely everything. Megan stepped back from the sliding window, the paper cup slipping from her fingers and splashing hot coffee across the dirty floor. She slid slowly down the greasy stainless steel wall of the drive-through booth, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. She buried her face in her rough, calloused hands and broke down sobbing. It was not the performative fake crying she used for the television cameras or the courtroom judge. It was a deep, guttural, agonizing wail of pure defeat. The sound echoed off the cheap plastic walls, completely ignored by her busy coworkers and the indifferent world outside. The architect had surveyed the ruins one last time, confirming the demolition was an absolute success. The harsh, unforgiving reality of the federal penitentiary system is designed to strip a man of his individuality long before it breaks his spirit. For Devin, the transition from a sprawling custom-built suburban mansion to an 8-by-10-foot concrete cage was a psychological shock that shattered his mind into unrecognizable fragments. He was no longer the arrogant tech investment director who wore tailored Italian suits and commanded rooms full of junior analysts. He was simply inmate number 84, wearing a standard-issue, heavily faded khaki uniform that offered no protection against the biting cold of the cell block. The pristine, imported marble floors he used to walk on were replaced by stained, cracked concrete, and the gourmet meals he once demanded were reduced to unidentifiable, flavorless lumps served on scratched plastic trays. In the brutal hierarchy of federal prison, a disgraced white-collar criminal with absolutely no street connections and a reputation for stealing from his own family was positioned at the absolute bottom of the food chain. Desperation, pure and unadulterated, quickly became his only companion. Stripped of his cell phone, his internet access, and his network of wealthy enablers, Devin resorted to the oldest, most primitive form of communication available to him. He began to write. Every single week he used his meager allotment of cheap, thin prison stationery and a dull golf pencil to draft frantic, weeping letters addressed to Anton Cole. He did not know where I lived. He was forced to mail the envelopes to a highly secure anonymous post office box strictly managed by Mr. Hayes' law firm. The letters were pathetic, groveling testaments to his complete destruction. He begged for small deposits into his prison commissary account so he could afford basic hygiene products and a decent bar of soap. But more than anything, he begged for a high-powered appellate lawyer. He frantically insisted that if I would just release a fraction of the funds I had seized from the sale of his mansion, he could hire a legal team to overturn his conviction and secure an early release. He wrote pages upon pages of fake apologies, empty promises, and desperate pleas for mercy, sending them out into the void week after week, genuinely believing he could still manipulate the man he had once planned to throw into a psychiatric ward. Hundreds of miles away from the bleak, towering razor-wire fences of the federal penitentiary, I sat in absolute undisturbed silence. The environment I had built for myself was the exact opposite of a prison cell. I was relaxing in my newly designed private study, a room I had meticulously constructed to reflect the immense peace I had finally achieved. The walls were paneled in rich, dark walnut lined with towering bookshelves filled with heavy architectural texts and classic literature. A warm, crackling fire burned steadily in the stone fireplace, casting a soft, golden glow across the polished hardwood floor. I sat behind a massive, custom-built oak desk, wearing a comfortable cashmere sweater, sipping a glass of rare-aged whiskey that I had purchased simply because I could. I was not hiding. I was thriving. The heavy, polished brass door handle of my study clicked open and my housekeeper quietly entered carrying a thick silver tray. Resting in the exact center of the tray was a tightly bound stack of mail forwarded directly from Mr. Hayes' office. I thanked her politely and picked up the stack. It consisted of 14 identical, cheap white envelopes, all bearing the unmistakable red ink stamp of the federal prison mail inspection system. Devon's handwriting, once a confident, aggressive scrawl on corporate memos and forged mortgage documents, was now shaky, frantic, and barely legible. He had written Anton Cole across the front of every single envelope, completely unaware that the father he was begging for salvation no longer existed. I held the thick stack of letters in my hands for a long moment, feeling the cheap texture of the paper. I did not feel a sudden rush of paternal guilt. I did not feel a lingering ache of sadness for the boy I used to take fishing. I felt absolutely nothing at all. They were just pieces of paper, administrative clutter from a closed project. I did not reach for my silver letter opener. I did not peel back the adhesive to read his desperate excuses or his tearful promises of rehabilitation. An engineer knows that once a toxic, structurally compromised element is safely removed from the primary framework, you do not bring it back into the building to examine it. You destroy it completely to prevent cross-contamination. I stood up from my comfortable leather chair and walked over to the corner of my study. Sitting quietly next to a tall oak filing cabinet was a heavy-duty industrial-grade cross-cut document shredder. It was a massive, powerful machine designed to completely obliterate highly sensitive corporate documents into microscopic, unreadable fragments. I flipped the power switch and the heavy internal steel blades roared to life with a deep, menacing mechanical hum. I did not hesitate. I took the entire stack of unopened letters, Devon's tears, his begging, his apologies, and his endless manipulation, and fed them directly into the feeding slot. The machine grabbed the envelopes violently, pulling them down into the spinning steel teeth. The sharp, satisfying sound of ripping paper filled the quiet study. In a matter of seconds, weeks of Devon's desperate labor were reduced to a pile of worthless white dust in the plastic collection bin below. I watched the last edge of the final envelope disappear into the blades, turned the machine off, and walked calmly back to my desk to finish my whiskey. The physical act of destruction was completely liberating. There would be no communication. There would be no reconciliation. The silence between us was no longer a weapon he could use against me. It was a permanent, impenetrable shield I had built to protect myself. Right as I placed my empty crystal glass down on the oak desk, the secure encrypted landline phone sitting next to my computer monitor began to ring. I picked up the heavy receiver. It was Mr. Hayes. His voice did not carry its usual tone of predatory legal anticipation. Instead, he spoke with the quiet, respectful solemnity of a doctor officially calling the time of death. He informed me that he had just received a direct notification from the federal appellate court. Devon's overworked public defender had filed a desperate last-ditch appeal several months ago, attempting to argue that the initial sentencing judge had been overly harsh and had failed to properly consider Devon's lack of prior criminal history. The appellate process was Devon's absolute final sliver of hope, the single thread keeping him from completely surrendering to his 60-month sentence. Hayes paused for a brief moment, letting the silence hang on the line before delivering the final payload. He told me that a panel of 3 federal appellate judges had reviewed the case files, examined the financial ledgers, and watched the hidden camera footage of the forgery conspiracy. They had returned their decision in record time. The appeal was formally, unanimously, and permanently denied. The lead appellate judge had even taken the time to write a scathing addendum to the rejection, explicitly stating that Devon's calculated, remorseless exploitation of his own elderly father demonstrated a profound lack of moral character that fully justified the maximum penalty. Hayes confirmed that Devon had officially exhausted every single legal avenue available to him in the United States justice system. There were no more hearings to schedule. There were no more motions to file. The legal severance was completely finalized. Devon was legally locked away, financially ruined, and emotionally erased from my existence. I thanked Mr. Hayes for his exceptional, flawless work over the past year and gently placed the phone back onto its cradle. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the warm fire dancing in the hearth. The storm was completely over. The demolition was a total, unmitigated success, and the ground was finally clear. A full year passed since that final phone call with Mr. Hayes. The bitter, freezing winter that froze my son's assets and my daughter-in-law's future eventually gave way to a bright, relentless spring, and then to a deeply productive summer. I did not spend that year sitting idle in my comfortable leather chair, sipping aged whiskey and reflecting on the ruins of my past. An engineer is fundamentally a builder. Once the demolition is fully complete and the hazardous debris is cleared away, the only logical next step is to lay a brand new foundation. I stood in the center of a massive, active construction site located in the heart of one of the city's most historically disadvantaged, heavily neglected neighborhoods. The neighborhood had been forgotten by the wealthy city developers left to rot in the shadow of the glittering downtown financial district where men like Devin used to steal millions. But I saw the raw, untapped potential beneath the broken pavement. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting smell of freshly poured concrete, hot asphalt, and cut pine. The deafening roar of heavy excavators and the sharp, rhythmic pounding of pneumatic nail guns echoed off the surrounding brick tenement buildings. I was no longer wearing my tailored charcoal suits or expensive cashmere sweaters. I was wearing scuffed, steel-toed work boots, heavy denim jeans, and a bright yellow hard hat. I unrolled a large, heavily annotated set of architectural blueprints across the hood of a dusty pickup truck, tracing the intricate structural lines with my calloused index finger. For the first time in over a decade, I felt the profound electric surge of genuine purpose coursing through my veins. I was not just killing time in my retirement, I was actively designing a fortress. The massive steel framing rising rapidly against the clear blue skyline was not a luxury condominium complex or another soulless corporate office building. It was a state-of-the-art multi-purpose community center specifically designed for the at-risk African-American youth of the district. It featured a fully equipped indoor athletic facility, an extensive technical library, high-speed computer labs for coding classes, and a comprehensive vocational training workshop. And every single brick, every steel beam, and every pane of shatterproof glass was completely paid for using the massive financial restitution I had systematically stripped from Devin and Megan. The $150,000 Megan had arrogantly handed me to upgrade my own property paid for the entire advanced robotics laboratory. The liquidated assets from their seized mansion covered the massive foundation pour and the commercial plumbing systems. Even the punitive damages awarded by the civil court were funneled directly into a perpetual scholarship fund for the teenagers who would eventually walk through these doors. I had successfully converted their toxic, selfish greed into a permanent engine for generational growth. As I stood there reviewing the electrical schematics, a heavy hand clapped me warmly on the shoulder. It was Marcus, the lead site foreman and a highly respected local community leader. He handed me a thermos of black coffee, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile. We spent the next 20 minutes enthusiastically debating the load-bearing capacity of the gymnasium roof, treating each other with the profound mutual respect of men who actually knew the value of hard work. I was not surrounded by arrogant tech executives or superficial social media influencers trying to extract my wealth. I was surrounded by honest, hardworking people who looked at me not as a walking bank account, but as a trusted mentor and a true friend. Over the past year, these construction workers, local teachers, and neighborhood organizers had slowly become the genuine family I had been missing. They did not care about my offshore retirement portfolios or my luxury watches. They cared about the massive bronze plaque currently sitting carefully wrapped in my office, waiting to be permanently mounted above the main entrance of the building. The plaque read, "The Nadine Cole Youth Center." My late wife had spent her entire life fiercely advocating for underprivileged children, pouring her heart into underfunded public school systems. Devin had callously tried to use her sacred memory to manipulate his way out of a federal prison sentence. I chose to honor her memory by building a sanctuary that would outlast us all, ensuring her name was permanently synonymous with hope, protection, and opportunity. I watched a group of local kids playing basketball on a cracked court across the street, knowing that in just a few short months they would have a safe, state-of-the-art facility to call their own. The deep, agonizing wound of my son's ultimate betrayal had not just healed, it had transformed into a profound, unbreakable armor. I folded up the heavy blueprints, tucked them securely under my arm, and walked slowly toward the edge of the active construction site. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the freshly poured concrete foundation. I looked up at the massive steel skeleton of the building, feeling the absolute, undeniable permanence of what we were creating. I turned away from the noise of the heavy machinery and looked directly ahead, piercing through the illusion of the space around me to speak directly to you. My journey did not end in tragedy, and it certainly did not end in defeat. It ended exactly the way a properly engineered project is supposed to end, with a flawless execution of a carefully designed plan. For years, I allowed myself to be quietly dismissed. I played the role of the silent, generous father, constantly absorbing the disrespect, the financial draining, and the casual cruelty of a son who believed he had outgrown the very man who gave him everything. They genuinely believed that my patience was a symptom of old age. They thought my silence was weakness. But an engineer knows that before a flawed structure collapses, it gets very, very quiet. The steel groans the concrete splinters deep within the foundation, and the warning signs are always completely ignored by the arrogant people living comfortably inside. I did not rage. I did not scream. I simply identified the fatal flaws in their greedy lives and systematically pulled the support columns away one by one. I let their own incredible arrogance do the heavy lifting, allowing the sheer weight of their selfishness to crush them into dust. What I learned from the wreckage is a lesson written in permanent ink. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. A shared last name does not give anyone the right to systematically destroy your peace or drain your resources. You are under absolutely no obligation to tolerate abuse simply because you share a genetic code with your abuser. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away, change the locks, and let the predators starve outside. I look at this massive building rising from the dirt. I look at the dedicated community surrounding me, and I feel absolutely no regret for the devastating choices I had to make. I didn't lose a son. I demolished a hazard to build a legacy. The deafening roar of the heavy excavators and the sharp pounding of the hammers slowly faded away, replaced by the quiet, absolute peace of a man who finally owned his own life. The golden sunlight reflecting off the steel beams slowly dimmed, and the screen faded entirely to black. The greatest lesson I learned is that true power resides in the quiet, absolute enforcement of your own personal boundaries. Society constantly demands that older parents sacrifice everything willingly, setting themselves on fire simply to keep their ungrateful children warm. I completely refuse to accept that highly destructive narrative. Your dignity is never a cheap currency to be spent on selfish people who only value you for what they can ruthlessly extract. Protect your peace with the exact same calculated precision you use to protect your life. Subscribe to my channel right now and share your personal survival story below.